Hello, my friend. I'm glad you found your way here tonight. Come in, get comfortable, and let's slow everything down together for a little while. Because tonight I want you to imagine something. You're 17 years old. Tomorrow morning you will marry a man you've spoken to 3 times in your entire life. And right now, somewhere downstairs, 2 fathers are deciding your future in coin, in cattle, and in land, while you sit upstairs alone in a dress you never chose. This was not a nightmare. For hundreds of years across most of Europe, this was simply a Tuesday. Before we step inside her room, I want to ask you for something small. If these quiet journeys into real history are the kind of thing that pulls you in, take just a second to like this video, subscribe if you have not already, and leave a comment down below. Tell me where you're watching from tonight and what time it is where you live right now. I check every single one, and it always makes this feel less like a video and more like sitting with an old friend. And now let's set the mood properly. Dim the lights if you can. Maybe turn on a fan or anything that hums softly in the background. Let your shoulders drop and your blanket pull up close. Because tonight we are travelling back roughly 500 years to a small stone house in the north of England on the morning of a wedding that nobody thought to ask a young woman's true opinion about. The village outside is only just waking up. Smoke curls thin and grey from a few early chimneys. Somewhere a rooster is being loudly, uselessly optimistic about the hour. Frost sits along the low stone walls, and the fields beyond them stretch out flat and pale, still holding on to the last of the night's cold. Inside one particular house at the edge of that village, a single small window glows with candlelight far earlier than it should. Her name for tonight is Isabel. She is not one single person pulled from one single record. She's a composite, a gentle stitching together of hundreds of real young women drawn from court records, family letters, and church documents from the 14th and 15th centuries. But everything you're about to hear, the customs, the fears, the small quiet rules, all of it happened to someone many times over. It is still dark outside when her mother wakes her. Not the gentle waking of an ordinary morning. This is careful, almost ceremonial. There is a basin of water already warmed by the fire. There is a gown laid across the chest at the foot of the bed, the good one, the one usually kept, folded away in linen and lavender. Isabel sits up slowly, and for one long moment before her mind catches up to the day, she almost forgets what morning this is. Then she remembers, and her stomach drops quietly like a stone into a still pond. 6 months earlier, this day did not exist in her mind at all. Isabel had never spoken his name. She had never seen his face. What she remembers instead is standing outside her father's study one evening, holding a tray she was meant to carry in, and hearing her own name pass between 2 low, serious voices on the other side of the door. She remembers setting the tray down very carefully on the floor. She remembers pressing her ear closer than a proper young woman ever should have. And she remembers her father saying in a voice too calm to be casual that terms had been reached. That is the phrase history keeps handing us over and over in old letters and old court records. Terms had been reached. Not love had been found, not a heart had been won. Terms. Because in most of medieval Europe, marriage was rarely about 2 people falling for each other. It was closer to a business merger sealed with a wedding instead of a signature. Land was joined to land. Debt was quietly settled with a daughter instead of coin. A family with a strong name but thinning pockets married into a family with heavy pockets, but a thinner name, and everybody nodded and called it a good match. Isabel had met her betrothed exactly 3 times before this morning. The first meeting, she was not even truly permitted to speak to him directly. Her mother sat beside her the entire visit, and aunt sat behind her, and the conversation moved mostly between the 2 fathers, low and businesslike, all acres and grain and boundary lines, while Isabel sat with her hands folded, offering a small practiced nod whenever someone happened to glance her way. The second meeting unfolded almost exactly the same. only this time he was permitted to sit slightly closer and to ask her once whether she preferred the countryside or the town. She had answered honestly. He had seemed for a moment almost surprised that she had an opinion at all. The third meeting he brought her a small carved comb wrapped in plain cloth. Their fingers touched for one accidental second as she took it from his open hand, and that tiny, ordinary moment felt to her almost dangerously exciting. That was the entire courtship. 3 visits, a comb, and now a wedding. I know how strange that sounds to modern ears. But here is something worth sitting with for a moment. This was not seen as cruelty, not by most people living through it. It was simply how the world worked. Daughters were quite plainly considered one of a family's most valuable assets, right alongside their land, their cattle, and their name. And nobody thought to ask the cattle for an opinion either, so in a strange, uncomfortable way, Isabel's silence was not unusual at all. It was expected. Her mother dresses her in near silence, fastening laces down the back of the gown, adjusting the fall of the sleeves, tucking a stray curl beneath a soft linen cap. Every so often her mother's hands pause on her shoulders, just for a breath, as though she wants to say something and cannot quite find the shape of it. Finally she does. He seemed a fair man, her mother says quietly, steady, not unkind. It is not much, but in a world with almost no promises to offer a young bride, not unkind was sometimes the kindest, most honest thing a mother could say. By the time the sun is fully up, Isabel is walking through the village surrounded by family neighbours and a priest in dark robes toward the small stone church at the edge of the fields. Along the way, older women lean out of doorways to watch her pass, and a few of them press small worn hands to their chests, smiling in a way that looks, if Isabel is honest, closer to remembering than to celebrating. One woman, ancient and stooped, catches her eye for just a second and gives her the smallest possible nod, the kind that seems to say, I stood where you are standing and I am still here. And here is a detail that surprises most people the first time they hear it. They do not go inside the church, not yet. In much of medieval England, the actual wedding vows were not spoken inside the building at all. They were spoken outside at the church door in full daylight in front of the entire gathered village. The doors themselves were thrown open behind the couple, so that God quite literally stood as witness from within, while the whole community stood as witness from without. Marriage was never meant to be a private matter. It was a public one, almost a performance proof laid out for everyone to see that a bargain had been properly lawfully sealed. Isabel stands at that threshold now, the worn stone step beneath her thin leather shoes, her betrothed beside her in his good doublet, looking, if she is honest, almost as nervous as she feels. And this is the part I find most fascinating of all. By church law at the time, a priest was required to ask her directly out loud in front of everyone whether she consented to this marriage. It had been written into canon law decades earlier, this idea that a valid marriage needed a free and willing yes from both people, not merely their families. On paper, Isabel had a choice. On paper, she could have said no right there in front of the entire village, with her father standing 3 feet away, and every plan of the last 6 months balanced on her one word. Take a moment and sit with that. A choice that technically exists but practically does not. A door that is in theory unlocked, but so heavy, so watched, so wrapped in consequence, that almost nobody ever tries to open it. The priest asks the question. Isabel does not look at her betrothed. She looks instead at her mother's face in the small crowd, finds it, and holds on to it like a hand reaching back for hers. And she says yes, quietly, steadily. The way you say a line you've been rehearsing in your head for 6 months, even though nobody ever told you the actual words out loud. The rings are exchanged. A small bag of coins is placed into her open palm and then poured back into his, an old custom, symbolizing the wealth now shared between them. The doors of the church open fully behind them, and together they step inside for the marriage mass. And somewhere behind her, Isabel can hear someone in the crowd already laughing about the feast to come, as though nothing enormous has just happened at all. Afterward there is food and music and far too much ale, and for a little while the whole village seems to forget that this was ever a negotiation at all. Long wooden tables are dragged out into the open, piled with bread and roasted meat that most families rarely see outside a wedding or a harvest feast. Isabel's pulled into a dance she does not fully know the steps to her new husband, awkwardly close behind her, both of them laughing more out of nerves than anything else. Someone's grandmother tells a joke about husbands and cows in the same breath, loud enough to make even Isabel's new husband turn faintly red. For a few hours under torchlight, surrounded by people who have known her since before she could talk, it almost feels like an ordinary happy day, the kind that could belong to anyone in any century. But something enormous has happened. A 17-year-old girl has just promised her entire future, her body, her household, her children not yet born to a man she has met 3 times, based on a decision made by 2 fathers around a fire over land and cattle, and the closing of a debt. And here is what keeps this story from being simple. Isabel is not necessarily walking into misery. History is full of arranged matches that grew slowly and quietly into real affection, even real love built over years of shared work, shared hardship, shared children. And history is equally full of matches that curdled into loneliness or worse. The honest, uncomfortable truth is that nobody standing at that church door that morning, not Isabel, not her mother, not the priest himself, actually knew which kind of marriage this one would turn out to be. That uncertainty, that is the real heart of this entire story. Because underneath every single dating rule we're going to look at together tonight, every rule about who a woman was allowed to speak to, how she was allowed to dress, how closely she had to be watched, and yes, even the truth behind that infamous, mostly mythical device you have probably already heard whispered about, underneath every single one of those rules sits the same quiet question Isabel carried through that church door. What happens when you have almost no say in who you will spend your entire life beside? To really answer that, we cannot stay in this one moment on this one morning with this one girl. We have to go back further. Back before the wedding dress, back before the church door, back to the actual rooms where these marriages were built in the first place, not with candlelight and not with vows, but with negotiation, calculation, and sometimes quiet desperation. So settle in a little deeper, get comfortable, because that is exactly where we're going next. So let's step into that room now, the one I mentioned only a moment ago. The one with the low fire and the 2 fathers and the quiet, careful business of deciding somebody else's entire future. Picture it plainly. 2 men, maybe old acquaintances, maybe strangers, introduced by a mutual neighbour, sitting across a table with cups of watered wine going warm and forgotten between them. There is no candlelight for romance in this room, no music drifting in from somewhere else in the house. There is only a ledger, a handful of coins laid out for demonstration, the smell of tallow smoke, and a long, slow conversation about exactly how much a daughter is worth. I want to be honest with you about something right at the start of this part of the story. That sentence probably made you flinch a little. It made me flinch too the first time I sat with it properly. But if we are going to understand medieval dating rules honestly, and not just collect shocking facts to feel superior about, we have to sit inside that discomfort for a moment instead of rushing past it, because here is a truth almost nobody explains clearly enough. In the medieval world, a wedding was rarely the beginning of a love story. It was the final signature on a contract that had been drafted, revised, and argued over for months. And the currency of that contract had a name. It was called a dowry. Most of us have heard the word before, tossed around in movies or costume dramas, usually without much explanation. So let's actually understand what it meant, because the reality is far more interesting, and far more revealing than the word alone suggests. And these negotiations did not simply happen between two households acting alone. Across much of medieval Europe, there was often a third figure quietly involved, someone we would recognize today as a matchmaker. Sometimes it was an aunt with a reputation for good judgment. Sometimes it was a parish priest who happened to know every eligible son and daughter within a day's ride. Sometimes, especially in wealthier circles, it was a hired go-between, paid specifically to scout out suitable families, carry proposals discreetly, and smooth over the awkward early stages before two fathers ever sat down face to face. Love, as we understand it now, had almost nothing to do with the job. Compatibility of fortunes did. A dowry was property, money, land, sometimes livestock, sometimes household goods, that a bride's family handed over to her new husband's family essentially as her ticket into the marriage. Think of it less like a gift and more like an entry fee, one paid by the bride's side to secure the match. The richer the husband's family or the more prestigious his name, the steeper that entry fee tended to be. And here is where it gets uncomfortable in a very specific way. A daughter's marriage prospects were tied directly to how much her family could afford to pay for her. Not her kindness, not her wit, not whether she made people laugh at the dinner table. Her value in the coldest, most transactional sense was measured in coin and acreage. Now, before you picture every medieval father as some cartoon villain rubbing his hands together over his daughter's price tag, let's slow down and add some nuance here, because that is not quite fair either. Most fathers were not cruel men. Many honestly believed they were protecting their daughters, securing them a stable household, a name withstanding a husband capable of feeding a family through a bad harvest. In a world with no social safety net, no widow's pension, no legal protections, we would recognize today a good marriage really was one of the only forms of insurance a woman could have. That does not make the system fair. It just makes it a little more human and a little more complicated than a simple story about a greedy father selling off his daughter. So how much are we actually talking about here? It depended enormously on where you stood on the social ladder, and this is where the story gets truly interesting. Because medieval Europe was never one single dating culture. It was dozens of overlapping ones layered by class, by region, by how much land your family actually controlled. At the very top among nobility and wealthy gentry, dowry negotiations could stretch on for months, sometimes years, handled almost like small international treaties. Lawyers in the loosest medieval sense of that word were sometimes brought in. Letters crossed back and forth between estates. A daughter's marriage portion, as it was often called, might include entire parcels of farmland, townhouses, herds of cattle, chests of silver plate. This was not romance. This was diplomacy with a wedding dress attached to it. And these agreements were rarely simple handshakes. They were detailed, sometimes almost obsessively so. A contract might spell out exactly when each portion of the dowry had to be paid, sometimes in installments spread across several years rather than handed over all at once. It might specify what the groom's family promised in return, often a portion of land or income set aside specifically for the bride, meant to support her if she happened to outlive her husband, and it frequently included penalty clauses. If either family backed out after terms had already been agreed, church courts sometimes got involved, and the broken promise could cost the retreating family dearly in coin, and just as painfully in reputation. A cancelled match did not simply embarrass two young people for a season. It could follow a family for a generation, now travel down the social ladder into the world of merchants and townspeople, and the picture shifts in an interesting way. Here marriage often became a tool for something almost opposite. Instead of consolidating existing wealth, families used marriage to climb. A wealthy merchant with no title might offer an enormous dowry specifically to buy his daughter, and by extension his own family name entry into the lower ranks of the gentry. Meanwhile, A noble family with an impressive lineage but embarrassingly empty coffers might happily marry a son off to a merchant's daughter, trading their ancient name for desperately needed cash. Status for money. Money for status. It is honestly not so different from certain quiet conversations that still happen at weddings today, even if we dress the language up more gently now. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. If marrying well was really this expensive, this calculated, how did anyone without money ever manage to marry at all? And then there is the world most historical dramas conveniently skip over entirely. The world of ordinary peasant families, the overwhelming majority of medieval Europe's actual population. Here is something that truly surprised me the more I looked into this. In many parts of medieval England, a peasant woman, particularly one legally classified as unfree tied to her lord's land, could not simply decide to marry whoever she chose. She, or more often her father, sometimes had to pay a fee directly to the local lord for permission. Historians call this fee a merchet, and it shows up again and again in old manorial court records, small unglamorous entries listing exactly which family paid exactly what so their daughter could be allowed to marry. Why would a lord care who a peasant woman married at all? Because in a world built almost entirely on labour, losing a woman to a marriage outside the manor often meant losing a working pair of hands, and eventually losing the children she would have raised as future labourers on his land. Permission to marry was rarely about romance to the man standing behind that ledger. It was about keeping his workforce exactly where he needed it season after season, generation after generation. Sit with that for a second. Even love between two poor farmers, two people with no land worth negotiating over no title, no political alliance at stake, could still require a payment to a man who owned the ground they lived on simply for the privilege of choosing each other. It is one of those details that never makes it into the romantic paintings, isn't it? No knight, no castle, no candlelit hall. Just a small line in a dusty ledger recording that a farmer paid a few coins to a lord he had probably never shared a meal with so his daughter could marry the boy from the next field over. And yet, strangely, historians generally agree that among this same peasant class something closer to real affection had a better chance of surviving the wedding day. Not because peasant life was easier, it absolutely was not. But because there was simply less property at stake. When a family has cattle coin and titles riding on a match, they tend to control it tightly. When a family has very little to protect a daughter's own preference, sometimes carried just slightly more weight in the final decision, if only because there was less for her parents to lose by allowing it. I find that small detail almost tender in a strange way. The less a family had, the more room a young woman occasionally found to actually choose. Now let's cross the sea for a moment, because this is not only an English story, and I do not want you walking away thinking these rules stopped politely at one coastline. Travel south into Italy, into cities like Florence and Venice during the later medieval and early Renaissance period, and you find dowry culture pushed to an almost startling extreme. Competition among wealthy merchant families grew so fierce, each trying to outbid the next for the most prestigious sons-in-law, that dowry prices simply spiraled upward year after year, family after family scrambling to keep pace with their neighbours. It grew so severe that the city of Florence eventually created something almost unthinkable to modern ears. A public financial fund parents could pay into starting from the year a daughter was born, slowly building enough money over her childhood to afford marrying her off respectably by the time she reached her teenage years. Essentially, a government savings account built entirely around the anxious mathematics of finding a daughter, a husband. The longer a family left their money sitting inside the fund, the more it grew, which meant the smartest fathers started saving almost from the moment a daughter was born, quietly betting on her future marriage the way we might now open a savings account for a child's education. And for families who still could not keep up even with a fund like that, there was often only one remaining option for extra daughters. Not marriage, the convent. Across Italian cities during this period, convents filled with young women who had no religious calling whatsoever, no burning devotion to a quiet life of prayer, only a father who had done the math and realized he could afford to marry off one daughter properly, perhaps two, but never all 4 or 5 of them. The rest were sent behind convent walls, sometimes at startlingly young ages, essentially removed from the marriage market entirely because the market itself had grown too expensive to compete in. Doesn't that reframe something for you? We tend to imagine the convent purely as a place of faith, and for many women it absolutely was. But for others it worked as something closer to an economic escape hatch, dressed in a habit instead of a wedding gown. I want to pause here and ask you something honestly because I'm curious what you think. If you had been born into a family with 5 daughters and only enough money to marry off 2 of them respectably, what do you imagine that dinner table conversation actually sounded like? Drop your guess in the comments below. I would honestly love to see it, because here is what strikes me most sitting with all of this laid out in front of me. We like to imagine the medieval marriage market as something cold, mechanical, almost inhuman fathers moving daughters around a chessboard like property. And in the coldest financial sense, that description is not entirely wrong. But underneath every single one of these negotiations, whether it happened beside an English fireplace over a handful of coins or inside a Florentine counting house with a dowry ledger stretching back years, there was still a family trying to survive inside a system they did not invent using the only real tool they had. Not affection, not romance, leverage. I think about what all of this must have done quietly to a young woman's sense of her own worth. Growing up hearing herself discussed in terms of acreage and coin, watching her value calculated the exact same way a herd of cattle or a plot of farmland might be assessed. Not every woman absorbed that message the same way, of course. Plenty found small pockets of agency inside a system built specifically to deny them any, and pushed back in quiet, clever ways history rarely bothered to record. But it is hard to imagine growing up inside that kind of arithmetic and coming out the other side without it leaving some kind of mark. And Isabel's father, sitting in that room we started with, was not so different. He was not calculating cruelty. He was calculating survival for his daughter, for his household, for a family name that had to outlast him. Whether that calculation happened to also protect her heart, well, that was never really the point of the exercise. It was simply the hope riding quietly alongside it. So the families made their deal, the coins were counted, the land was measured, the daughter was in the coldest legal sense transferred from one household's ledger to another. But the story does not actually end there, because there was one more party standing over every single one of these negotiations, watching closely with its own set of rules, its own demands, and frankly its own opinions about who was allowed to love whom, and how and when. And that party did not particularly care about dowries or land at all. It cared about something it considered far more important: souls. Which brings us to the one institution powerful enough to override even the wealthiest father's carefully negotiated deal if it truly wanted to, and to declare an entire marriage meaningless with a single decree. Let's step inside its rulebook next, because what waits there, the promises it made to women like Isabel and the promises it quietly broke, might honestly surprise you. Here is the rulebook then opened right in front of us. And I have to warn you before we go any further, it is far stranger and far more contradictory than most people expect, because the church did not simply bless marriages after families had already worked out the details. It considered marriage a sacrament, something sacred and permanent, ranked right alongside baptism in seriousness. Once a marriage was properly formed, almost nothing on earth could undo it. Not boredom, not cruelty in most cases, not even a husband's failure to provide, which today would send most of us straight to a lawyer. Only the church itself could rule a marriage invalid, and even then only under very specific, very narrow conditions, which makes what I'm about to tell you feel almost absurd by comparison. For a long stretch of the medieval period, roughly from the middle of the 12th century onward, the official position of the church was this: all it legally took to create a valid binding, lifelong marriage was for one man and one woman alone, with no priest, no witnesses, and no family present to look at each other and say the right words in the right tense. That was it. No church building required, no ceremony, no banns read aloud beforehand. Just two people and a sentence spoken freely. This ruling is usually traced back to a pope named Alexander III sometime in the second half of the 12th century, and it rested on one core idea, an idea that actually sounds surprisingly modern. A true marriage required consent. Real, freely given consent from both people involved not simply approval from their parents. On paper, this was almost a small revolution. It meant a marriage arranged entirely by two greedy fathers over a fireplace. The kind of negotiation we spent the last part of this story sitting inside could theoretically be challenged, if either the bride or the groom had never actually willingly agreed to it in their own heart and their own words. There was theology tucked underneath this idea too, not just legal cleverness. The church taught that a soul's relationship with God had to be freely chosen to mean anything at all. Forced faith was considered worthless faith. Some church thinkers of the period reasoned that marriage, being a sacrament, ought to follow that same basic logic. A vow spoken under pressure, in their view, was barely a vow at all. It is a strangely tender idea to find buried inside such a rigid institution, and I think it is worth giving credit where it is due, even while we spend most of this story examining everywhere that same institution fell short of its own ideal. Picture for a moment a young woman in exactly that position. Her family has already agreed to a match on her behalf. The dowry has been counted, the date has been set, and yet on paper, right up until the moment she actually speaks her own consent out loud, the church technically considers the whole arrangement unfinished business. Her parents could shake hands all they liked. Legally, none of it mattered until she herself said yes. Remember Isabel standing at that church door being asked out loud whether she consented. That question was not just tradition. It was the entire legal foundation of the marriage itself distilled into a single moment. Her yes was not decoration. It was technically the one thing the whole ceremony legally could not exist without. Now, you might already be sensing the obvious problem here, and if you are thinking exactly like a medieval bishop did. If two people alone, whispering the right words to each other in a barn, a garden, or a quiet corner of a market square were legally married the moment those words left their mouths, then marriage suddenly became something almost impossible to control. Young couples figured this out fairly quickly. A boy and a girl who fell for each other despite their family's objections could simply slip away somewhere private exchange, a few careful sentences, and technically become husband and wife on the spot with absolutely no one else's permission required. Historians actually have a name for this. They call it clandestine marriage, and church court records from across medieval Europe are full of it. A young woman claiming a man had promised himself to her in private, months earlier, now refusing to acknowledge it once a wealthier match came along. A man insisting he never said the specific words needed to make it binding, only similar ones, hoping a technicality might set him free. Entire families discovering sometimes years later that a son they had already married off respectably had technically promised himself to someone else first back when he was young and reckless, and standing alone with a girl behind a church wall. It became frankly a beautiful mess. Proof was almost impossible to gather. It was one person's word against another's with a lifelong legal contract, and often a family's entire reputation hanging on which version a church court decided to believe. Think about how impossibly small the evidence could be. A servant walking past a stable might later swear she heard two voices exchanging vows through a half-open door. A neighbour might recall a young man once joking half-seriously that he considered himself already married to a certain girl in the village, never quite realising those careless words spoken over an ale one evening could later be dragged into a church court as legal proof. Entire futures sometimes balanced on a single overheard sentence remembered imperfectly years after it was spoken. So by the early 13th century, the church did what large frustrated institutions tend to do. It tightened the rules considerably. In the year 1215, a massive church gathering known as the Fourth Lateran Council issued a sweeping set of reforms, and marriage was very much on the agenda. Secret private marriages were formally condemned. From this point forward, an upcoming wedding was supposed to be announced publicly out loud inside the local church on 3 separate occasions before the ceremony ever took place. These announcements were called banns, and their entire purpose was simple. It gave the whole community a window of time to speak up if they knew of any lawful reason the marriage should not happen. Perhaps one of the two was secretly already promised to someone else, or worse, already married. Try to picture an ordinary Sunday service under this system. The priest finishes his usual prayers, and then in the same steady voice he might use to announce next week's feast day, reads out 2 names, a young man and a young woman from the parish, stating plainly that they intend to marry and inviting anyone present to raise an objection if they know a reason why they should not. Most weeks silence followed. People shifted in their seats, maybe exchanged a glance or two, and the service continued. But every so often that silence broke, and an entire wedding, sometimes an entire family's carefully built plan, unravelled right there in the pews in front of everyone. If that phrasing sounds oddly familiar, it might be because you have heard its ghost before at a modern wedding in that old dramatic line still occasionally used today. Speak now, or forever hold your peace. That tradition did not appear from nowhere. It is quite literally the distant echo of banns of a community once being formally legally invited to object before God, and everybody 3 separate Sundays in a row. Priests who allowed a couple to marry without following this process could now be suspended from their duties. Couples who tried to marry secretly anyway risked having their children legally declared illegitimate, stripped of inheritance rights, a punishment severe enough to make most families think twice. The loophole was not entirely closed, not completely, but it had been made dramatically, deliberately inconvenient. Now here's a question worth pausing on for a second. Even once a couple followed every single rule, correctly banns read priest-present ceremony. Public, how did anyone actually confirm the 2 people standing at that altar were even allowed to marry each other in the first place? Because the church had another rule running quietly underneath all of this one that could unravel even the most carefully planned wedding after the fact. It forbade marriage between anyone considered too closely related, and the medieval definition of too closely related stretched astonishingly far, covering multiple generations of blood relatives on both sides of a family. For much of this period, the rule extended out to what was called the 4th degree, which in practical terms meant 2 people sharing a great-great-grandparent were still technically forbidden from marrying each other. In a small rural parish where most families had been living, working and intermarrying within the same few square miles for 100 years or more, that kind of family tree math got complicated astonishingly fast. And it did not stop at blood. The church also recognized something called spiritual kinship, which meant a person who served as a godparent to a child was from that point forward treated almost like blood, relative to that child, and to that child's entire family at least for the purposes of future marriage. In small villages where the same handful of families have been marrying godparenting and burying each other's relatives for generations, this created a wonderfully tangled web. Finding someone eligible to marry someone not technically a cousin, or a cousin's cousin, or spiritually tied through a long-forgotten baptism decades earlier, could quietly narrow the local dating pool to almost nothing. I have to admit there is something almost darkly funny about imagining a medieval village elder being pulled aside before a wedding to mentally trace 2 family trees back 4 generations just to make sure nobody was accidentally marrying a distant spiritually adopted cousin. And of course, because this is still a story about power and money as much as it is about faith. There was a way around even this rule. If a family had deep enough pockets, wealthy and noble households could apply directly to Rome for something called a dispensation, essentially official permission to marry, despite a forbidden family connection, granted in exchange for a fee, and sometimes a rather generous one. Kings and princes used this route, constantly marrying cousins to secure political alliances that a peasant family in the same situation could never have afforded to arrange. The rule, it turns out, bent rather easily for those who could pay to bend it, which is a pattern you have probably noticed showing up more than once already in this story. But the church's reach did not stop at the church door or even at family trees. It followed couples straight into their own homes, into the one part of marriage most people today would assume was entirely private. Medieval religious writing spent a surprising amount of ink on exactly when married couples were and were not supposed to be intimate with one another. Certain days of the week were discouraged, particularly days tied to fasting or prayer. Entire religious seasons, like the weeks leading up to Easter or the weeks leading up to Christmas, came with their own restrictions. Some guidance even touched on circumstances tied to pregnancy or a woman's monthly cycle. None of it was uniformly enforced, and plenty of ordinary couples almost certainly ignored large portions of it entirely quietly, the way people have ignored inconvenient rules in every century of human history. Historians who have added up all of these restrictions together, the weekly fasting days, the extended seasons like Lent and Advent, the various other holy observances scattered through the calendar, have suggested that in the strictest possible reading of these rules, something close to half the days of an entire year could technically fall under some form of religious restriction on marital intimacy. Half the year. Try explaining that particular calendar to a modern couple planning a honeymoon. But the fact that such detailed guidance existed at all tells you something important. In the medieval mind, marriage was never fully a private arrangement between 2 people. It belonged in some very real legal and spiritual sense to the church, to the community, and to God watching from somewhere just outside the bedroom door. Here's what I find most striking about everything we've just covered, if I am honest with you. The church's rules on paper actually gave women something remarkably close to a real legal shield. A woman could not technically lawfully be forced to marry against her will. Her consent mattered in ink in doctrine in the careful Latin of church law, but written protection and lived reality are 2 very different things, and the distance between them is exactly where most women actually lived. A father with enough patience, enough pressure, and enough creative persuasion could usually still get the yes he wanted one way or another, long before anyone reached the point of dragging a reluctant daughter in front of a church court to test the theory. I want to ask you something honestly, because I think it says a lot about how far we have and have not come. How different is that gap really between a rule protecting someone on paper and that same rule actually protecting them in practice? From certain gaps we still argue about today, I am not asking that to score any easy modern point. I am asking because sitting with medieval law long enough has a strange way of making you look a little more carefully at the laws sitting quietly around you right now, the ones we assume are working exactly as written. Let me know what you think down in the comments. I always find those conversations worth reading. We're going to meet some of those women directly later in this story, the ones who tried anyway, who took the church at its word and fought for it. Their stories are remarkable, and some of them will likely surprise you. But first, there is a much darker twist in this rulebook we need to sit with honestly, because it exposes just how far the gap between theory and reality could stretch. All of this careful language about consent, about a free and willing yes, quietly, assumed something rather important. It assumed the person standing at that altar was actually old enough to understand what she was agreeing to, and across much of medieval Europe that assumption did not always hold up particularly well. In fact, some of the most binding promises of a woman's entire future were made long before she was anywhere near old enough to make them herself sometimes, while she was still a small child holding her mother's hand with absolutely no idea what the word marriage even truly meant yet. Let's go there next, because it might be the most uncomfortable rule of all. Let's start with a number 1 that tends to stop people cold the moment they actually hear it stated plainly. 12. According to church law across most of medieval Europe, 12 was considered the minimum age at which a girl could legally give her consent to marriage. For boys, the number was 14. These were not arbitrary guesses. They were drawn from older Roman legal tradition built on the assumption that a person needed to reach a certain rough physical maturity before their consent to something this permanent could even be considered meaningful. I want you to sit with that for just a moment before we go any further, because it colours everything else we're about to talk about. Now, before your mind runs entirely toward the darkest possible interpretation of that number, and I understand completely if it already has, I need to walk you through something the history books rarely explain clearly enough. The medieval world actually drew a careful, deliberate line between two very different things that we tend to blur together today under one single word: marriage. The first was called a betrothal, sometimes recorded in Old Church Latin as a promise made in the future tense. This was essentially a formal, legally recognized intention to marry made now fulfilled later. And here is the detail that truly surprises most people. Betrothals like this could be arranged for children far younger than 12, sometimes for children who were barely out of infancy, occasionally among royal families desperate to lock in a political alliance for children who had not yet learned to walk or talk at all. These childhood betrothal ceremonies were often small, almost business-like affairs, nothing like a wedding as we would picture one. A ring might be exchanged, sometimes placed on the child's hand by a parent standing in for them. A few formal words were spoken often by adults on the children's behalf, sealing the arrangement in front of witnesses who mattered far more legally than the two small people the promise was actually about. In the most extreme political cases, the two children involved might not even meet in person for years afterward. The entire arrangement conducted through letters and envoys travelling between two distant courts. The second kind of promise was different, spoken in the present tense, and this one was the real thing. A true binding sacramental marriage, the kind we discussed at length a little earlier in this story, requiring genuine consent, and according to church teaching, requiring consummation to be considered fully permanently sealed. And crucially, the church insisted that this second stage could not legally happen before a child reached that age threshold: 12 for a girl, 14 for a boy. On paper, at least an infant betrothal was a promise about the future, not a marriage happening now. A contract signed by parents on a child's behalf, binding the families to each other, but not yet binding two actual bodies together in the way full marriage implied. Does that distinction make the whole picture comfortable? Absolutely not. A toddler still had her entire future quietly signed away by adults she would barely remember making the decision. But it does mean the popular modern image of tiny children being married off exactly the way we would understand a wedding today is not quite historically accurate. The reality was stranger, more bureaucratic, and in its own peculiar way, slightly more protective than that image suggests. Because here is the part I find most worth pausing on. The church actually built in an escape hatch. Once a child betrothed young finally reached that age of consent, 12 or 14, canon law gave them a real formal right to reject the arrangement outright, so long as the marriage had never been consummated. A young woman now old enough by the standards of the time to legally speak for herself could stand in front of a church court and simply say, "No, I do not consent to this." And if she had never lived as a wife to the man in question, the church, at least in theory, was required to release her from the promise her parents had made on her behalf years earlier. Think about that for a second. A system harsh enough to arrange a baby's future marriage was at the very same time required by its own rules to hand that same child a legal door marked exit the moment she was old enough to reach for the handle. Whether she ever felt safe enough or powerful enough or informed enough to actually use that door is an entirely different question, and an important one. Knowing a right exists on paper, and having the practical courage, family support, and legal knowledge to exercise it are two very different things, as we already spent an entire part of this story exploring together. But the door was there. That detail matters even if it was rarely swung open. So why would any family do this at all? Why lock a small child into a future they could not possibly understand yet? Because for the highest ranks of medieval society, kings, dukes, the wealthiest landholding families' marriage was never really about one household. It was foreign policy written in cradles instead of treaties. A king with a newborn daughter and a rival kingdom he desperately wanted as an ally, rather than an enemy, had every incentive to lock that alliance in early, before a competing suitor, or worse, a competing war could change the political weather entirely. Waiting until a daughter turned 16 or 17 to start negotiating meant risking years of shifting alliances, dead kings, broken treaties, and rival families swooping in first. Betrothing her at 3 or 4 years old, while undeniably strange to modern ears, was from a purely political chess-playing perspective simply smart, cautious, long-term planning. It is worth remembering too, and I think this actually matters, that this entire practice was almost exclusively a concern of the wealthy and titled. An ordinary farming family had no crown to protect no rival duchy, plotting against them, no land vast enough to justify locking in a marriage contract before a child could speak in full sentences. This was a habit of power, not a universal medieval custom, practiced in every cottage across the countryside. The higher you climbed on the social ladder, the earlier your future tended to be decided for you. And these childhood contracts were rarely left to good faith alone. Families frequently wrote penalty clauses directly into the betrothal agreement financial consequences owed if one side later broke the arrangement for a more attractive offer. A more powerful family might still walk away from a childhood promise if a better opportunity appeared years later, but doing so usually meant paying dearly for the privilege, which tells you something quietly important. Even a promise sealed in a nursery was underneath the ceremony, still a contract enforceable, negotiable, and occasionally broken anyway. The moment breaking it became more profitable than keeping it. And nowhere does that pattern of power controlling childhood futures show up more clearly or more troublingly than in a system historians call wardship. Here is how it worked. If a landholding father died while his heir, whether son or daughter, was still legally a minor, that child did not simply inherit everything and carry on. Under the feudal structure running across much of medieval Europe, the child, along with the land, the title, and crucially the right to arrange their eventual marriage, became the legal property in a very real sense of whichever lord or king sat above that family in the feudal chain. Read that again because it is worth sitting with. A grieving child having just lost a father could simultaneously lose control over their own future marriage to a total stranger, a king or lord who now legally owned the right to decide who that orphaned heir would eventually wed, or more accurately owned the right to sell that decision to the highest bidder, because that is precisely what frequently happened. Wardship became quite openly a lucrative business. A king holding the wardship of a wealthy young heiress could sell the right to arrange her marriage to whichever nobleman offered the most money, regardless of whether that nobleman or his son was remotely suitable kind or age appropriate for the young woman in question. The orphaned child's own preferences rarely, if ever, entered the transaction at all. She was in the coldest possible legal sense an asset changing hands not so different from the fields and cattle attached to her inheritance, and the exploitation frequently went further than the marriage itself. While a guardian held wardship over a young heir, they also typically controlled the income from that heir's land, sometimes for a decade or more, before the child legally came of age. Historians have long noted how tempting and how common it became for guardians to quietly strip an estate for their own benefit. During those years, harvesting timber, draining resources, delaying repairs, all while the rightful owner was still too young to object or even fully understand what was happening to their own inheritance. By the time some heirs finally came of age, they inherited a title and a noticeably thinner fortune than the one their father had actually left behind. And this abuse grew so widespread, so resented, that it eventually forced its way into one of the most famous documents in English history. Remember that year we spent time inside during the last part of this story, 1215, when the Church's Fourth Lateran Council was busy rewriting the rules around clandestine marriage. That very same year, in a muddy field in England, a group of furious noblemen forced their own king to sign a very different document, one you've almost certainly heard of, even if you have never read a single line of it: Magna Carta. Most people remember Magna Carta, if they remember it at all, as some vague founding stone of modern legal rights. Far fewer people realize that buried inside its clauses, sitting right alongside its more famous promises about fair trials and limits on royal power, are several lines specifically addressing exactly the abuse we're talking about right now. The Charter explicitly stated that heirs should be married without what the document called disparagement, meaning they should not be matched purely for a guardian's profit to someone far beneath their social standing, purely to squeeze out a higher payment or settle some unrelated political debt. This clause did not appear out of nowhere. It was widely understood at the time as a direct response to the previous king's own habits, a monarch notorious among his own noblemen for treating wardships as a personal treasury, auctioning off orphaned heirs and heiresses to whichever bidder offered the crown the most coin, with little regard for whether the match made any sense at all beyond the price attached to it. It is quite literally medieval England's own furious noblemen writing into law, "We are tired of watching our children auctioned off by whoever happens to be holding their wardship." That single detail tells you almost everything you need to know about how normalized and how resented this practice truly was. You do not write a protection into one of history's most important legal documents unless the abuse behind it had already become impossible to ignore. The same document in the very next lines tackled something closely related. Widows, it declared, could not be forced into a second marriage against their will, simply because a guardian or the crown itself saw profit in arranging yet another advantageous match, using her inheritance as bait. We will come back to that particular thread later in our story, because widowhood turns out to be a far more complicated and occasionally far more freeing chapter than most people expect. But for now, just notice the pattern quietly repeating itself. Wherever there was land money or a title attached to a woman, someone with power was almost always standing nearby, calculating exactly how much profit her future was worth. I keep coming back to one particular thought while researching this part of the story, and I want to be honest with you about it rather than just presenting facts and moving on. There is something deeply strange about a legal system sophisticated enough to build in genuine protections, an age of consent, a right of repudiation, a formal complaint against unfair wardship, and yet still allow in practice for a small child's entire future to be treated as a financial asset the moment her father happened to die. The rules were not entirely hollow, but they were consistently reliably outmatched by whoever held the most power in any given room. I do not say that to excuse it. I say it because understanding a system honestly means resisting the urge to flatten it into either pure villainy or pure innocence and medieval childhood betrothal. Uncomfortable as it is to sit with was neither one of those simple things. It was something messier, a genuine legal safeguard sitting right beside a genuine ongoing abuse of power, both true at exactly the same time. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment, honestly. Do you think most families arranging these childhood betrothals saw themselves as doing something cruel? Or do you think inside the logic of their own time this simply felt like responsible planning? The medieval equivalent of buying insurance. I would love to hear where you land on that down in the comments, because that question, more than almost anything else we've covered so far, is the real hinge this entire story swings on. Every single rule we've walked through together, the dowries, the church's careful consent doctrine, the wardship auctions, all of it existed inside a world that truly believed it was being sensible, even protective, according to its own internal logic. Cold calculated, unmistakably unfair by our standards, yes, but rarely in the minds of the people living it cruelty for its own sake. And yet remarkably, at the very same moment all of this cold legal machinery was grinding along in courtrooms and castle libraries, something entirely different was blooming in the same halls, sung by the same nobility, performed at the same feasts. An idea of love so passionate, so dramatic, so wildly disconnected from anything we've discussed so far that it almost feels like it belongs to a completely different century. Knights composing poetry, ladies receiving secret longing letters, an entire elaborate game of romance invented quite deliberately by people who just finished negotiating their own children's marriages over a business ledger an hour earlier. Let's go meet them next, because the contradiction between the ledger and the love song is almost too perfect for anyone to have invented on purpose. Picture the same great hall we've been sitting inside through most of this story so far. Only now imagine the ledgers put away, the marriage contracts rolled up and tucked out of sight, and in their place a fire, a harp, and a room full of powerful people about to take something utterly impractical, utterly illogical, and completely solemnly seriously. Because at the exact same moment fathers were negotiating dowries over cattle counts, and lords were selling off orphaned heirs to the highest bidder, something else entirely was catching fire in the courts of medieval nobility. An idea of love so dramatic, so theatrical, so wildly disconnected from anything resembling an actual medieval marriage that historians still argue today about how seriously anyone truly took it. They called it courtly love, and I promise you the contradiction sitting at the centre of it is one of the strangest things we will cover in this entire story. It began, as far as most historians can trace it, in the sun-soaked courts of southern France in the early decades of the 12th century with travelling poet-musicians known as troubadours. These were not simply entertainers hired to fill an evening with music. In the right court, a gifted troubadour could rise from relatively humble beginnings into genuine favour with kings and dukes using nothing but clever verse and a good singing voice, which honestly makes them one of the only groups in this entire story who could climb the social ladder through raw talent rather than land, coin or bloodline. The tradition is usually traced back to a duke named William IX of Aquitaine, Eleanor's own grandfather, who was by most surviving accounts not only a powerful nobleman, but also one of the earliest troubadour poets whose verses survive today. Imagine that for a second. The very same bloodline that would later produce one of medieval Europe's most politically formidable queens also produced a generation earlier a duke more interested in composing verses about longing and desire than in most of the political business his rank required of him. Whatever courtly love eventually became across the rest of Europe, it started quite literally as a family hobby that got wildly, extraordinarily out of hand, and what these troubadours sang about was a very particular, very specific fantasy. A noble knight hopelessly devoted to a lady far above his reach, usually married, usually unavailable, admired from a careful, respectful distance, his devotion expressed through poetry, secret glances and grand romantic gestures that were never according to the polite fiction of the genre supposed to lead anywhere physical at all. Here's where it gets truly strange, so stay with me. This entire tradition took root and flourished most enthusiastically in the court of one of the most powerful women medieval Europe ever produced, Eleanor of Aquitaine, granddaughter of an early troubadour patron herself, and later through her daughter, Marie of Champagne, courtly love found its most famous, most detailed rule book. Sometime in the final decades of the 12th century, a writer known to history simply as Andreas the Chaplain composed a Latin treatise addressed to a young friend named Walter, who had apparently come to him confused and lovesick asking for guidance. Andreas obliged at enormous length, producing a work modern readers usually call The Art of Courtly Love, structured almost like a legal manual, complete with definitions, case studies, and most famously a list of 31 formal rules governing exactly how a proper courtly lover was meant to behave. Marie of Champagne did not simply inspire this treatise from a distance either. She was an active literary patron in her own right, commissioning one of the era's most celebrated poets, a writer named Chrétien de Troyes, to compose romances that would go on to shape European storytelling for centuries afterward. It was under her patronage that one of the most famous courtly love stories ever written took its now familiar shape, a tale of forbidden devotion between a legendary knight and a queen who was quite pointedly already married to someone else entirely. If that particular flavour of romantic tragedy sounds oddly familiar even today, it should. Almost every secret, doomed, achingly unavailable love story Western culture has produced since owes at least some quiet debt to exactly this tradition. Now, before I share a few of those rules with you, I want you to actually guess what you think might be on that list. Take a second. If you were writing the official rule book for secret, elegant, aristocratic romance 800 years ago, what is the very first rule you would put at the top? I will tell you the answer Andreas actually chose, and I suspect it is not what most people expect. Rule number 1, according to his treatise, stated plainly that marriage was no valid excuse for refusing to love someone else. Sit with that for a moment, especially after everything we have just spent this entire story examining together. The exact same aristocratic world that spent months negotiating dowries, drafting marriage contracts with the seriousness of international treaties, and occasionally locking children into betrothals before they could speak in full sentences, was simultaneously entertaining itself with an elaborate literary tradition, insisting that real, meaningful romantic love almost could not exist inside marriage at all. It gets stranger still. Andreas recorded what he described as debates held by noble ladies, acting almost as judges presiding over hypothetical disputes about the rules of love, sometimes called courts of love. In one famous ruling attributed to this tradition, it was formally decided that true love simply cannot exist between a husband and wife, on the reasoning that lovers must be free to give and withhold their affection at will, while married couples bound by duty and obligations no longer had that freedom to withhold anything from each other at all. I have to pause here and give you my honest reaction to that particular piece of medieval logic because it made me laugh out loud the first time I read it properly. The argument is not that marriage kills romance because people simply grow comfortable or bored the way we might casually joke about it today. The argument is a formal, almost legal one. Obligation itself was considered the enemy of real desire. If you were required to love someone by contract, by church law, by family duty, then whatever you felt for them could never technically qualify as courtly love at all, no matter how honestly fond of each other you actually were. Now, a fair question worth asking here, and historians still do not fully agree on the answer, is how literally any of this was ever actually meant. Were these courts of love real gatherings, actual noblewomen formally settling romantic disputes the way a modern court might settle a property dispute? Or was the entire thing closer to an elaborate parlour game, a sophisticated piece of court entertainment performed with a wink? Everyone involved fully aware they were engaging in an artful fiction rather than genuine jurisprudence. Most serious historians today lean toward the second explanation, closer to theatre than law. But I would gently push back on the idea that this makes the tradition any less meaningful. Sometimes the fictions a society invents tell you just as much about its inner life as its actual laws do, maybe more, because fiction reveals what people secretly wished were true underneath everything they were legally required to accept instead, and what courtly love quietly revealed underneath all its poetry and performance was a longing for exactly the thing the rest of this story has shown you. Medieval marriage almost never offered choice, mutual desire, a love that existed because two people wanted it, not because two fathers had already signed the paperwork. There is another detail buried inside these rules that I find worth lingering on, especially given who is likely watching this tonight. Within the strange fictional logic of courtly love, women were almost always positioned as the ones holding power. The knight served. The knight suffered. The knight composed increasingly desperate poetry, hoping for the smallest sign of favour, a glance, a token, a single kind word. The lady, meanwhile, judged withheld granted favour at her own pace entirely on her own terms. In a world where real medieval women had shockingly little control over their own marriages, dowries or futures, as we have spent the last several parts of this story establishing quite thoroughly courtly love, quietly imagined a parallel universe where a woman's affection was the single most valuable, most fiercely competed for thing in the entire castle. It could not undo a single arranged marriage. It could not cancel a single dowry negotiation. But as a fantasy performed at court, sung in front of entire households, it let women occupy a kind of power. The legal system almost never granted them anywhere else. I do not think that is an accident, and I do not think medieval women missed the significance of it either. Think about what that reversal must have felt like, even briefly, even only within the boundaries of a song. A noblewoman who had almost certainly been handed to her husband as a teenager, negotiated over like the land attached to her name, sitting in that same great hall decades later, watching a grown knight compose verse after verse, simply hoping to earn one small nod of her approval. For the length of an evening inside the safe fiction of the game, she was not the asset being traded. She was the prize being pursued, the judge whose opinion actually mattered, the one person in the entire arrangement whose feelings were treated as the whole point rather than an afterthought. I would not call that justice, but I understand completely why so many women seem to have embraced the game so enthusiastically anyway. Here's something else worth knowing, because it shows just how seriously some medieval thinkers took all of this far beyond simple entertainment. Physicians of the period actually wrote about lovesickness as a real diagnosable medical condition, sometimes called by a Latin name meaning something close to heroic love. Sufferers, according to these medical texts, could experience genuine physical symptoms: sleeplessness, loss of appetite, a racing heart, even fever, all attributed directly to an obsessive, unfulfilled romantic longing. Andreas himself opened his entire treatise by defining love in strikingly similar terms, describing it as a kind of inborn suffering that overtakes a person almost against their will. Some physicians even prescribed remedies for it, ranging from distraction and travel to, in more extreme cases described in surviving medical writing, the recommendation that the sufferer simply be allowed to be with the object of their affection, since nothing else seemed to reliably cure the condition. So this was not simply poets being dramatic for effect. Some of the sharpest medical minds of the era truly believed unfulfilled longing could make a person physically ill, which honestly makes modern breakup songs feel almost restrained by comparison. There is one more piece of this puzzle worth mentioning before we move forward, because you have almost certainly encountered its legacy without realizing where it came from. The word romance itself traces directly back to this period, originally simply meaning a story written in the common spoken language of the people, rather than formal church Latin. Stories about knights' quests and impossible love affairs were exactly the kind of tales most often told in that popular vernacular tongue, and over time the word describing the language quietly became the word describing the subject matter, those stories obsessed over most. Every single time you use the word romance today, you are technically borrowing directly from this exact tradition from noble courts, 800 years ago, entertaining themselves with stories about love that was by careful design never supposed to happen inside an actual marriage at all. It is a strange little inheritance to carry around in ordinary conversation without realizing it, a word born from tales specifically about love outside of marriage, now used constantly to describe the love we hope to find inside one. I want to ask you something honestly, because I am curious how this lands for you specifically. Does it feel oddly familiar, this idea of an entire culture building elaborate fictional love stories, precisely because their real romantic lives felt so tightly controlled and so disconnected from genuine choice? I will let you sit with that question yourself. Feel free to tell me your take down in the comments. I always enjoy reading them, because here is where I land on all of this after spending a considerable amount of time inside these old rules and rulings. Courtly love was never really a rebellion against the arranged marriage system we have spent this entire story examining. It could not afford to be. The dowries still had to be paid, the alliances still had to be sealed, the children were still in the highest circles, still occasionally betrothed in the cradle. Courtly love existed comfortably alongside all of that, not in genuine defiance of it, but almost as its pressure valve, an elegant, socially acceptable outlet for exactly the kind of longing the marriage system itself was never built to satisfy. It let a knight write poetry about a love he could never act on. It let a noblewoman feel for the length of a song like the most powerful person in the room, and it let an entire aristocratic culture quietly admit through fiction, through elaborate rules, through imaginary courtroom rulings about hypothetical lovers, something almost none of them were permitted to say plainly out loud: that the marriages arranged for them, however politically sound, however financially secure, were rarely built around anything resembling the kind of love these same people spent their evenings singing about. But here is the uncomfortable twist we've not fully sat with yet, and it is the twist that turns this entire elegant fantasy into something considerably darker the moment you look closely enough. All of this admiration, all of this poetry, all of this careful devotion from a distance was still happening inside a culture obsessed with controlling exactly what a woman's body was allowed to represent, how pure it needed to appear, how carefully it needed to be guarded, watched, and judged by everyone around her. And nowhere does that obsession show up more vividly or more strangely then in the physical standards medieval women were quietly, relentlessly expected to meet standards that had almost nothing to do with any of the poetry we just spent this entire part admiring. Let's look at exactly what those standards demanded next, because some of it might make you wince. Let's start with the forehead, because honestly, nothing quite prepares you for how seriously medieval Europe took this one particular detail. If you look closely at portraits from the 14th and 15th centuries, you will notice something a little unusual about many of the women staring back at you. Their foreheads look enormous, smooth, almost impossibly high, stretching well past where a natural hairline would ever sit on its own. That was not an accident of painting style. That was the beauty standard itself, and women worked quite literally to make it happen. To achieve that towering domed forehead, women plucked their hairlines back strand by strand, sometimes several inches further than nature had originally intended. Some accounts describe an even more permanent method, using a heated pin against the follicle itself so the hair would simply stop growing back at all. Read that again slowly. Not a quick, painful pluck and done. A deliberate, repeated, sometimes literally scorching process aimed at convincing your own body to stop producing hair in a particular spot permanently for the sake of fashion. There was no anesthetic waiting on the other side of that decision, no numbing cream, nothing to soften the moment beyond whatever quiet resolve the woman brought into the room herself. Beauty in this particular corner of medieval life was not something applied gently in front of a mirror. It was something earned through pain, deliberately chosen over and over, appointment after appointment, in pursuit of a look that could never actually grow in on its own. And the eyebrows rarely survived this trend either. The fashionable look called for a smooth, almost blank expanse of skin above the eyes. So many women removed their eyebrows entirely, leaving behind what one modern historian rather memorably described as a mask-like serenity. No arch, no shape. Just a wide, pale, uninterrupted stretch of forehead and brow, considered at the time the very picture of refinement. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second before we move any further. Why on earth would an entire culture decide that having less hair in such a specific, painful, deliberately engineered way counted as beautiful? Because this was never simply about fashion for its own sake. In the medieval imagination, that pale, open expanse of forehead was believed to communicate something deeper, something almost spiritual. A high, unblemished brow was read as a sign of a clear, untroubled mind, and by extension, a clean, virtuous soul. Beauty, in other words, was not treated as skin deep at all. It was treated as visible proof of inner purity, which meant physical appearance carried a kind of moral weight we mostly do not attach to it today. That connection between paleness and virtue runs even deeper once you look at how women approach their overall complexion. A pale, untouched, almost porcelain white face was considered the gold standard of medieval feminine beauty, partly because it signalled something very specific about a woman's life. Tanned, weathered skin marked you as someone who worked outdoors in the fields under direct sun, which immediately placed you lower on the social ladder. A pale face, by contrast, quietly announced that you had never needed to labour a day in the sun in your entire life. Beauty and class once again turned out to be nearly inseparable, and women chased that particular shade of pale by any means available, some of them unfortunately truly dangerous. The most common method involved a substance called cerusa paste made primarily from white lead mixed, and applied directly onto the face and neck to achieve that prized porcelain glow. It worked in the sense that it did produce a striking pale finish. It also slowly and quietly poisoned the women wearing it. Repeated use of lead-based cosmetics has been linked to skin damage, hair loss, and gradual lead poisoning, which in serious cases could affect major organs over time. Women were in a very real sense risking their long-term health in pursuit of a complexion that had been culturally coded as pure, virtuous and desirable. I find that particular detail almost unbearably ironic, if I am honest with you. An entire beauty standard built around the idea of purity, moral cleanliness, and untroubled inner life achieved in practice through a slow, invisible poison applied directly to the skin. Nothing about that is pure at all. It is one of history's quieter, crueler jokes, and the stakes around appearance did not stop at simple beauty pressure. In some cases, they edged dangerously close to genuine physical risk. Moles, birthmarks, and unusual skin markings, features we would today consider entirely ordinary, sometimes even charming, carried a far darker reputation in the medieval mind. These marks were occasionally associated with witchcraft, treated as suspicious, even sinister signs that something unnatural marked the body underneath. Women went out of their way to hide or remove them, not simply out of vanity, but sometimes out of genuine self-protection. A birthmark was not always just a cosmetic inconvenience. In the wrong place at the wrong moment in front of the wrong accuser, it could become evidence. We will spend far more time later in this story on how accusations like witchcraft actually played out for medieval women. For now, simply notice how quietly beauty and safety overlapped. A blemish was never purely cosmetic in a world already primed to search a woman's body for signs of something sinister underneath. Let that sink in for a second. A beauty standard with actual physical danger quietly stitched into its underside. Now you might reasonably assume the church stayed entirely out of all this, focused purely on souls rather than eyebrows. You would be wrong. Religious authorities of the period frequently condemned deliberate hair removal and cosmetic enhancement as a form of vanity, a genuine moral failing worth mentioning directly from the pulpit. Some accounts describe priests scolding women they suspected of plucking their hairlines purely for fashion, treating it as evidence of sinful pride. But even here, the rule bent in a very specific, very telling direction. If a woman removed hair or altered her appearance to correct what was considered a genuine disfigurement, or more tellingly still, to avoid being looked down upon by her own husband, the same religious authorities were often willing to look the other way. Vanity for its own sake was sin. Vanity in service of keeping a husband satisfied was apparently forgivable. I will let you sit with what that particular double standard reveals about whose comfort medieval morality was actually built to protect. Hair itself carried its own quiet code entirely separate from the forehead trend. Unmarried women were generally permitted to wear their hair loose, and visible, a small socially sanctioned display of youth and availability. Once married, that same hair typically disappeared beneath a veil, a wimple, or later increasingly elaborate headdresses, some towering so high that certain great houses reportedly had to widen their doorways just to let fashionable women pass through comfortably. Try to picture that scene honestly for a second. A noblewoman ducking, tilting her head at precisely the right angle, timing her entrance through a doorway like a small everyday performance, simply because the very symbol of her modesty and status had grown tall enough to become a genuine architectural inconvenience. A woman's hair, in other words, was not simply a personal style choice. It was a walking, visible announcement of her marital status, read instantly by anyone who passed her in the street. And if you happen to want fashionably golden hair rather than your natural shade, medieval women had methods for that too, none of which I would personally recommend trying at home. Recipes involving saffron onion skins, and in some surviving accounts even sheep's urine, were applied to the hair before sitting in direct sunlight, sometimes wearing a wide-brimmed hat with the crown cut entirely open, so sunlight could reach the hair while still shading the prized pale face underneath. Picture that for a moment, an elegant, expensive gown, a face carefully kept out of the sun, and a hole cut directly through an otherwise fashionable hat, purely so hair could bake in direct sunlight for hours. Beauty apparently has never once in human history been particularly dignified in its actual execution, only in its final result. Clothing carried its own set of rigid, legally enforced rules layered directly on top of all of this. Sumptuary laws passed in various forms across medieval England, and much of Europe dictated exactly what fabrics, colours, and even fur trims a person was legally permitted to wear based entirely on their social rank. A merchant's wife, however wealthy, could be legally barred from wearing certain furs or fabrics reserved specifically for nobility. One well-documented English statute from the 1360s spelled this out in remarkable detail, regulating not just clothing but even diet, according to exactly where you sat in the social order. Certain furs, certain dyes, even the length of a woman's train trailing behind her gown, could all be dictated by rank rather than personal taste or budget. A wealthy merchant's daughter might have every coin necessary to dress exactly like a duchess, and the law would still forbid her from doing it, precisely because looking the part too convincingly threatened the entire visible hierarchy the system depended on. Beauty then was never simply about individual taste. It was a visible, carefully policed hierarchy stitched directly into the law. Here's something worth pausing on, especially given everything we have already established earlier in this story about how marriage actually functioned. The medieval beauty ideal was not really built around individual preference at all, the way we might casually discuss attraction today. It was built quite deliberately around fertility and status. Art and writing from the period consistently praised wide hips, a softly rounded figure, and features read as youthful and healthy, all of it coded, whether consciously or not, as visible advertising for a woman's capacity to bear children successfully. Remember, every negotiation, every dowry, every careful calculation of a daughter's worth. We walked through earlier in this story. Beauty was never separate from that economy. It was in a very real sense part of the asset being appraised. I want to pause on that connection for a moment because I think it is easy to skim past without fully absorbing it. When a father sat across from another family negotiating his daughter's future, her appearance was not a private personal matter sitting outside that conversation. It was part of the pitch. A pale complexion, a fashionably high forehead, a figure read as healthy and fertile, all of it, functioned almost like supporting evidence in a much larger financial argument. Beauty did not simply help a woman feel confident walking into a room. In the coldest, most transactional sense, it helped raise her price. Even fingernails got pulled into this quiet, constant performance of status. Long, carefully kept nails signalled that a woman had never needed to perform rough manual labour, another small visible marker separating the leisured elite from everyone working the fields to support them. And none of this happened in isolation quietly inside one woman's private routine. Sisters, cousins and neighbours were all measuring themselves against the exact same narrow standard in the exact same small social world, often competing whether openly or quietly for the attention of the very same small pool of eligible, financially suitable men. A slightly paler complexion, a slightly higher forehead, a slightly more fashionable gown could noticeably shift where a family's negotiating position landed at the marriage table. Beauty was not simply personal, it was competitive in ways that likely felt exhausting, long before anyone had a word like that to describe it. I do want to gently correct one popular modern assumption before we move on, because it comes up constantly whenever people discuss this period. Despite the popular image of medieval Europe as universally filthy and unwashed, the reality was considerably more complicated. Regular bathing tooth cleaning and the heavy use of perfumes and scented waters were highly valued, particularly among the upper classes, and personal cleanliness carried real social importance. Perfume was not simply covering up neglect. It was in its own right another small fragrant marker of refinement and status, layered right alongside the pale skin and the towering forehead. And before you assume all of this pressure landed exclusively on women, it is worth noting briefly that men were not entirely exempt either. A slender waist-shapely legs shown off deliberately through tight-fitted hose, and in some cases quietly padded calves to exaggerate a more muscular silhouette, were all seriously fashionable ambitions for medieval men chasing their own version of an idealized figure. The particular pressures were different and considerably lighter than what women faced, but the basic exhausting human impulse to sculpt your body toward whatever your century happened to admire clearly was not invented recently. Here is what I keep circling back to the longer I sit with all of this. We tend to imagine beauty standards as a relatively modern anxiety, something invented by magazines, then amplified by social media feeds scrolling past us every single day. But medieval women were living inside an equally demanding, equally punishing set of expectations, enforced by religion, by law, by economics, and quietly by real physical danger, centuries before a single camera ever existed to photograph any of it. Do you think honestly that we have actually made meaningful progress since then? Or do you think we have simply traded one exhausting ever-shifting standard for another dressed in more modern language? I would love to hear your honest take on that down in the comments, because here is the uncomfortable thread running underneath everything we have covered in this part of the story. A woman's appearance was never treated as purely her own business, something she alone got to define or enjoy privately. It was assessed, judged, priced, and moralized by nearly everyone around her, from the parish priest questioning her vanity to the lawmakers dictating her wardrobe to the family, quietly factoring her looks into whatever marriage negotiation lay ahead. And that same relentless scrutiny did not stop at her forehead, her hairline, or her choice of fabric. It followed her everywhere she went, watching how she walked, who she spoke to, how long she lingered in conversation with any man who was not her husband or her father. Because in medieval Europe, a woman's reputation turned out to be even more fragile and far more carefully guarded than her carefully powdered, dangerously pale complexion ever was. Let's step into that world of constant watching next, because it might explain more about medieval dating than almost anything we have covered so far. Here's a strange little fact to open, with one that quietly reframes almost everything we have covered so far about medieval dating. A private conversation held alone without a chaperone present was not simply considered improper in the medieval world. In certain circumstances, it could be treated as legally dangerous. Remember what we uncovered earlier in this story, that peculiar rule allowing two people to create a fully binding lifelong marriage using nothing but spoken words exchanged privately with no priest, no witnesses, and no ceremony required at all. Now hold that fact right next to this one. If a young man and woman were ever caught alone together, even briefly, even innocently, rumour alone could later be twisted into a claim that a secret betrothal had taken place behind that closed door. A stolen moment of privacy was not just scandalous. It was technically a legal liability. Even small, seemingly harmless gestures carried more legal weight than we would ever assume today. Accepting a gift from a hopeful suitor, exchanging a particular kind of promise, even certain specific words, spoken half seriously in a private moment, could later be dragged into a church court and argued over as evidence of a binding intention to marry. Remember that carved comb we mentioned earlier in this story, quietly passed from one hand to another during a supervised visit. A gesture that's small, repeated in the wrong context without the right witnesses present to frame it correctly, could theoretically become exhibit evidence in a dispute over whether two people had technically already promised themselves to each other. That single overlap explains more about medieval chaperone culture than almost anything else I could tell you. Because once you understand that the constant exhausting supervision women lived under for their entire unmarried lives stops looking like simple old-fashioned prudishness and starts looking a lot more like risk management. A mother, an aunt, an older servant, someone was almost always positioned nearby whenever an unmarried woman spent time with a man who was not her father or brother. Not necessarily because anyone truly believed something scandalous was about to happen, but because the mere appearance of privacy carried its own quiet danger, both legal and social, and reputation itself functioned almost like a second dowry one that could not be measured in coin or land but mattered just as much at the negotiating table. A woman's family could offer an enormous fortune, impressive lineage, glowing letters of introduction, and still watch an entire proposed match collapse overnight if enough people in the right circles started whispering the wrong rumor about her conduct. Wealth could be recounted and verified. Reputation once damaged was nearly impossible to fully restore, no matter how untrue the original rumor happened to be. Let me ask you something honestly before we go further. Have you ever watched an entirely false rumor spread faster and do far more damage than the actual truth ever could have? If so, you already understand on some level exactly what medieval women were navigating their entire adolescence and young adulthood, just without the added weight of it, determining whether they would ever marry at all. So what did this supervision actually look like day to day in practice? For wealthier families, it often meant a near-constant companion, an aunt, an older cousin, or a trusted household servant specifically tasked with accompanying a young, unmarried woman almost everywhere she went outside her own home. Visits from suitors happened in shared rooms, in full view of at least one older relative, conversations, conducted just quietly enough for privacy, just loudly enough to remain clearly, deliberately overheard. Letters, when they were exchanged at all, frequently passed through a household scribe or servant, first meaning even a woman's most private written thoughts often were not entirely private at all. For families further down the social ladder, formal chaperones in that sense were often an unaffordable luxury. But that does not mean supervision simply disappeared. It just changed shape, becoming something closer to the entire community watching rather than one dedicated person. In a small medieval village where most families had known each other for generations, everyone effectively chaperoned everyone else, simply by existing within a tightly knit, endlessly observant social world where very little happened unnoticed for long. Privacy in the modern sense we casually take for granted today was in many ways a luxury reserved almost exclusively for the wealthy who could afford walls, private rooms and land large enough to occasionally disappear onto. There is something almost backward about that reality if you sit with it for a moment. We tend to assume wealth buys freedom, and in most areas of medieval life it certainly did. But when it came to a young woman's ability to simply exist unobserved for even a few private minutes, poverty occasionally offered something closer to it, if only because a struggling family had neither the spare household staff nor the spare time to dedicate an entire person to watching one daughter constantly. Wealth bought supervision. It rarely bought privacy. Now here is where the story gets considerably more concrete and considerably stranger, because this was not simply social pressure floating in the air. In parts of a medieval England, actual formal financial penalties existed for what the law of the time bluntly called unchastity. Historians refer to this particular fine as layerwhite, and you will find it recorded again and again in old manorial court rolls, small dry entries listing exactly which women were fined and how much for engaging in premarital sexual activity while legally bound to a lord's manor. It functioned almost like a sibling to the marriage fee we discussed earlier in this story. Another small, unglamorous payment extracted directly from a woman's body and behaviour, this time not for the privilege of marrying, but as a formal financial punishment for allegedly failing to remain chaste beforehand. Sit with the strangeness of that for a second. An institution invested enough in controlling a woman's sexual conduct to formally price it, write it into a ledger, and collect payment for it the exact same way a lord might fine a tenant for letting livestock wander onto the wrong field. And these were not small symbolic sums, either easily brushed off by a struggling family. For many unfree households already living close to the edge of what their land could provide, a fine like this represented a real meaningful financial setback. One more small tax extracted directly from a woman's private life and handed over to a lord who had contributed nothing to the situation beyond owning the ground her family happened to live on. And notably, there was rarely, if ever, an equivalent fine recorded for the men involved in these same encounters. The consequence, financial, social, and reputational, landed overwhelmingly, almost exclusively on the woman's side of the ledger. That imbalance runs straight through nearly every corner of this topic. A young man's premarital reputation, generally speaking, could survive rumour gossip, even fairly open acknowledgement of past relationships largely unscathed. A young woman's could not. The exact same behaviour judged by two entirely different standards depending entirely on which body had supposedly engaged in it. I do not think this imbalance was ever really about morality at all, whatever language people used to justify it at the time. It was about inheritance, and it always came back to inheritance. A family needed absolute certainty that any child born into the household truly belonged to the man whose name and land that child would eventually inherit. A father's premarital conduct never threatened that certainty in the slightest. A daughter's did, at least in theory, which meant her body carried a kind of legal weight his simply never had to. But here is a detail I think deserves real credit because it complicates the picture in a way most people do not expect. Medieval women were not simply passive targets of this reputation economy, quietly absorbing whatever rumours circulated about them. Many of them fought back formally through the courts. Church courts across medieval England handled a surprising steady stream of what were called defamation cases, lawsuits, brought specifically because someone had publicly damagingly called another person's sexual reputation into question. And a striking number of these cases were brought by women themselves formally suing a neighbour, a rival, sometimes even a former suitor, for spreading claims that threatened to brand them as unchaste in front of the entire community. These were not quiet, informal complaints. They were real legal proceedings with witnesses called testimony recorded and genuine consequences for whoever was found to have spread false claims. Picture the shape of one of these cases for a moment. A young woman, furious and humiliated after a neighbour loudly accused her, perhaps at a market, perhaps after church, of behaviour that threatened her entire reputation, formally brings that neighbour before a church court. Witnesses are called to describe exactly what was said and where and how loudly, and who else was standing close enough to hear it. The accused neighbour is made to answer for the claim directly under oath, in front of the same community that had already started whispering about it. Sometimes the accusation held up. Often historians have found it did not, and the original accuser was the one left publicly formally corrected. I find that detail almost quietly thrilling, honestly. In a system stacked overwhelmingly against them in nearly every other legal and financial arena we've explored throughout this story, reputation turns out to be one of the very few battlegrounds where medieval women could and regularly did step directly into a courtroom and fight back, using the system's own rules against the very people trying to destroy them. It did not fix the underlying unfairness of the double standard itself. A woman still should never have needed to defend her reputation this aggressively in the first place, over behaviour that would have cost a man almost nothing socially. But it does complicate any flat, one-dimensional image of medieval women as purely silent, purely powerless figures, simply enduring whatever the world decided to say about them. Some of them quite literally sued back. I think that detail deserves to sit right alongside the harder, heavier facts we have covered throughout this story, not to soften them, but to round them out honestly. History rarely offers us pure villains and pure victims cleanly separated. It offers us people operating inside brutally unfair structures, occasionally finding the one narrow crack in the wall wide enough to push back through. When a woman's reputation collapsed entirely beyond what any court case could repair, medieval communities had their own theatrical, deeply public ways of marking the failure. Certain regions practiced forms of public penance for sexual transgressions, sometimes requiring the offending woman to stand at the church door or walk a public procession in plain humble clothing, visibly acknowledging her fault in front of the very community whose opinion had just determined her entire social future. It was punishment designed specifically to be witnessed, humiliation as a kind of public performance meant to reinforce the rules for absolutely everyone watching, not simply to punish the one woman standing at the centre of it. Neighbours who had known her since childhood, who had perhaps once considered her a good match for their own sons, would watch that same procession in near total silence, absorbing the lesson being staged specifically for their benefit as much as hers. I want to pause here and offer you an honest personal observation, because I think it matters more than it might first appear. We like to imagine reputation destroying rumour and the particular cruelty of an entire community turning against one person based on gossip rather than fact, as a distinctly modern problem, something invented by comment sections and anonymous online accounts. But medieval villages were in their own quiet, slower-moving way, running an almost identical machine, just without screens, without hashtags, without the speed of instant global reach. The fundamental mechanism, one person's private conduct, becoming public property judged ranked, and punished by an audience that mostly was not actually present when anything happened, has apparently been running in the background of human social life for a very, very long time. Only the scale has changed. A medieval rumour travelled as fast as a village could talk, reaching perhaps a few dozen households before it settled into permanent local memory. A modern rumour can circle the entire planet before a person even wakes up to see it. The mechanism, unfortunately, has never really needed updating. We simply gave it a much larger stage to perform on. Here's a question worth sitting with, honestly, especially given everything else we have already walked through in this story together. If a woman's entire future, her marriage prospects, her family's standing, her financial security could realistically hinge on rumour alone, true or false, how much of medieval courtship do you think was actually driven by real affection, and how much of it was simply quietly about managing appearances well enough to survive? I would love to hear your honest read on that down in the comments, because I do not think there is one single correct answer, because underneath all of this, watching, all of this careful supervision, all of these formal fines and court cases and public penances, sits one final, deeply uncomfortable idea we have circled around all through this story, without quite naming it directly yet. The medieval world was obsessed almost hysterically, so with controlling a woman's body specifically, her behaviour, her appearance, her reputation, her very right to privacy, all of it treated as something requiring constant active management by everyone except the woman herself. And that obsession eventually produced one of the strangest, most persistent legends in all of popular medieval history, a legend you have almost certainly heard whispered about before, usually with a slightly uncomfortable laugh attached to it. A physical device supposedly locked around a woman's body specifically to guarantee her fidelity while her husband travelled far from home. Most people believe without question that this device was real common and widely used throughout the medieval period. Almost none of that turns out to be true, and the actual story behind the myth is in its own way even stranger than the legend itself. Let's finally get into it next. Alright, let's finally talk about the device, because I suspect a good number of you already have a very specific, very confident image sitting in your mind right now. You have probably heard some version of this story before, maybe from a movie, maybe from a passing joke, maybe from a museum gift shop keychain that treated the entire thing as a punchline. A knight preparing to leave for war or the Crusades locks his wife into a metal device around her hips before he rides off, the only key tucked safely into his own saddlebag guaranteeing her fidelity for however many months or years he happens to be away. The chastity belt. Practically a mascot for how people imagine medieval marriage. It is a wonderfully cinematic image, honestly. Torches flickering against stone walls, a heavy wooden chest creaking open cold iron, catching candlelight as it closes around her, the small definitive click of a lock, and then a husband riding off towards some distant battlefield, satisfied that he has solved permanently and mechanically a problem no amount of trust apparently could. It shows up in film, in comedy sketches, in casual conversation, almost always delivered with a knowing little laugh, the kind reserved for facts everyone assumes are simply obviously true. Here is the uncomfortable truth I need to hand you after everything else we have already covered together in this story. It almost certainly never happened. Not the way you have heard it. Not during the medieval period at all. I know how that sounds, especially after 7 parts of me telling you, in exhausting, well-documented detail, exactly how much real control medieval society exercised over women's bodies, reputations, and futures. So let me be clear about something important before we go any further. This is not me softening the picture or suggesting things were actually fine. It is almost the opposite. The real history did not need a fictional metal device to be disturbing. It was already disturbing enough on its own, using nothing but ledgers, finds, and rumour exactly the tools we've spent this entire story examining. So where did the chastity belt legend actually come from, if not from real medieval workshops and real medieval marriages? The earliest known written reference to anything resembling this device shows up remarkably late in the year 1405 inside a book called Bellefortis, written by a German military engineer named Conrad Kaiser. And here is the detail that should immediately make you suspicious of the whole legend. Bellefortis was not a marriage manual or a moral treatise or a household guide. It was a book about siege warfare, catapults, fortifications, and military engineering. The chastity belt appears there almost as a passing aside, briefly sketched alongside genuine tools of war, in a tone many historians now read as darkly comic, rather than sincerely instructional, closer to a soldier's crude joke scribbled into the margins of a serious technical manual than an actual documented, widely used household object. One single, ambiguous, possibly satirical reference buried inside a book about siege machinery. That is essentially the entire medieval paper trail this legend is built on. Think about how strange that placement actually is once you slow down and consider it properly. Imagine flipping through a modern military engineering manual filled with diagrams for tanks, fortifications, and defensive walls, and stumbling across one small, oddly placed illustration of a padlock for a spouse, tucked between 2 pages about siege towers. You would immediately suspect you had stumbled onto someone's private joke rather than genuine standard issue equipment. Most serious historians reading Kieser's original manuscript today reach roughly the same conclusion. It reads far more like dark soldierly humour scrawled into a technical text than like documentation of a real common household item sitting in castles across Europe. Now let's talk about the practical problem, because I think it deserves more attention than it usually gets. Historians studying this question have pointed out quite bluntly that a locked metal device fitted directly against the body raises immediate serious problems that any actual medieval blacksmith or physician would have recognized instantly. How would a woman safely urinate? How would basic hygiene be maintained during her monthly cycle? How would infection be avoided in an ear already struggling badly with wound care and basic sanitation, wearing a rigid metal object directly against sensitive skin for weeks or months at a time? One historian researching this question put it almost perfectly, asking how such a device could possibly have been designed to permit ordinary bodily functions, while somehow still preventing everything else. Nobody researching this seriously has ever found a satisfying answer, because the honest answer is that nobody ever needed one. The object was never actually built for daily use in the first place. I like to imagine the conversation a medieval blacksmith would have needed to have if a nobleman actually walked into his workshop, requesting one of these on his way out the door to war. Questions about fit, questions about maintenance, increasingly uncomfortable questions about exactly how his wife was expected to survive several months inside it without serious medical consequences. I suspect most blacksmiths would have quietly suggested he simply trust his wife instead, and saved everyone involved a great deal of metalwork. Here's a fair question worth pausing on for a second. If the device was this impractical and the historical evidence this thin, why does almost everyone still confidently believe it was real? Because of what happened several centuries later in museums, not medieval workshops. Beginning in the 18th and 19th centuries, a period absolutely fascinated by the idea of a dark, superstitious, cruelly repressive medieval past, actual physical chastity belts began appearing for the first time in significant numbers. Museums eager to draw curious crowds displayed these devices confidently as genuine medieval artifacts. Major institutions holding these collections have since re-examined their own pieces, using modern historical and metallurgical analysis, and the findings are fairly damning. The overwhelming majority of surviving chastity belts were manufactured centuries after the medieval period supposedly ended, often explicitly as novelty items, morbid curiosities or private jokes for wealthy collectors fascinated by an imagined, exaggerated version of medieval cruelty. One major museum has openly stated that most of the chastity belts in its own historical collection were produced in the 18th and 19th centuries specifically as curiosities, rather than genuine artifacts from the era they claim to represent. A museum in Budapest dedicated to the history of medicine went even further, building an entire exhibition specifically around debunking the myth, walking visitors directly through the evidence piece by piece, showing exactly how a legend everyone assumed was settled. Fact had actually been manufactured quite literally generations after the period it claimed to document. Read that again. The very objects people point to as proof medieval chastity belts were real, sitting behind glass in respected museums for generations, mostly turn out to be Victorian-era inventions built specifically to look convincingly dramatically old. It took serious academic effort to finally untangle this properly. A university researcher specializing in German medieval studies, a scholar named Albrecht Classen, eventually published an entire book dedicated to tracing exactly how this myth formed and spread, examining centuries of supposed evidence and finding almost none of it held up under real scrutiny. His conclusion after years of dedicated research was about as blunt as academic writing gets. The medieval chastity belt, as popularly imagined, essentially never existed as a real common functioning object during the period it is supposedly from. What I find most compelling about his research is not simply the conclusion itself, but the sheer scale of the search behind it. He spent years combing through medieval manuscripts, court records, medical texts, and household inventories, the exact same kinds of sources we have leaned on throughout this entire story, specifically looking for any credible mention of these devices actually being manufactured, purchased, or worn. He found essentially nothing. No blacksmith's receipt, no household inventory listing one among a family's possessions, no court case involving a wife injured or a husband accused of cruelty over an object that supposedly sat locked around thousands of women's bodies for centuries. For an object popular imagination insists was common enough to become a defining symbol of an entire era that is an extraordinarily quiet paper trail. Compare that silence to how loudly the record speaks on almost every other topic we've covered tonight. Dowries itemized down to the coin betrothal contracts, with penalty clauses court cases over a single overheard sentence. Medieval clerks documented an almost obsessive amount of daily life. Their near-total silence on this one particular object is not an absence of evidence by accident. At this point it functions as evidence in its own right. So why even now, even after historians have thoroughly picked this legend apart, does it refuse to actually die? I think the answer says considerably more about us than it does about medieval history, and I want to offer you my honest take on it. The chastity belt survives, I suspect, because it is a satisfying, simple, almost cartoonish symbol for something we already correctly suspect was true about the medieval control of women even without a literal metal device to prove it. It gives modern audiences a single visual, slightly titillating shorthand for an entire complicated system of dowries, wardship, reputation courts, and canon law we have spent this whole story carefully unpacking together. One dramatic object is simply easier to imagine and frankly easier to joke about than 7 separate legal and economic systems working quietly together across several centuries. There might be something a little more uncomfortable tangled up in its popularity too, if I am honest. A locked device carries a strange kind of dark allure to it, a mixture of fascination and unease that keeps people coming back to the image, retelling it, half laughing at it long after any serious historian could confirm it as fact. One researcher who spent considerable time studying why this particular myth refuses to fade suggested that people are drawn to examining sexuality through history precisely because it lets curiosity dress itself up as scholarship. I think there is real honesty in that observation. It is simply more comfortable to gawk at an invented metal device than to sit uncomfortably with a real dowry ledger. But here is what I find almost more interesting than the myth itself. The real mechanisms of control we have actually documented throughout this story, verified in court records, church rulings, and legal statutes, were in their own quiet way considerably more effective and considerably more inescapable than any locked metal device could ever realistically have been. You cannot pick a lock on a dowry negotiation. You cannot slip out of a wardship contract through a hidden seam. You cannot simply remove a reputation once ruined the way you might theoretically remove an uncomfortable belt. Ask yourself honestly, which sounds more escapable to you, a locked object a good locksmith could probably defeat in an afternoon, or a lifetime contract witnessed by an entire village backed by church law, family expectation, and the full weight of everyone's memory? The real tools of control were administrative, financial, and social, which made them in a strange way far harder to escape than a piece of metal a clever locksmith could probably have picked in an afternoon anyway. I keep circling back to one particular thought while sitting with all of this, and I want to share it honestly rather than just moving past it quickly. There is something worth noticing in the fact that popular imagination reached for an exaggerated, dramatic, almost cartoonish myth, rather than sitting with the quieter, more bureaucratic, more truly unsettling truth. Maybe the real history dowries measured in coin, and cattle children promised away in the cradle reputations destroyed by rumour alone felt somehow less shocking, precisely because it looked so ordinary, so procedural, so much like paperwork rather than cruelty. A locked metal device feels like villainy. A ledger entry quietly recording a woman's fine for unchastity just feels like Tuesday. And maybe that quieter version is actually the more disturbing one precisely because nobody needed to hide it, dramatize it, or lock it away behind museum glass at all. It simply sat there in plain sight in the official record, treated as routine. Maybe that is ultimately the real lesson hiding inside a myth about a fake metal lock. We are all of us drawn toward villains we can clearly see, objects we can point to, locks we can imagine picking. We are far less naturally drawn toward the slow, patient paperwork version of control, the kind that never needed a dramatic reveal because nobody watching ever thought to question it in the first place. If this story has done anything so far, I hope it has trained your eye to notice that second, quieter kind of control just as clearly as the first. Here's a question worth sitting with honestly for a moment. Do you think stories like the chastity belt myth end up doing real history any favours? Or do you think by making the past feel more cartoonishly cruel than it actually was, they accidentally let the quieter, well-documented cruelty slide by unnoticed, because it simply looks less dramatic by comparison? I would love to hear where you land on that down in the comments below, because if there is one thing I hope this particular part of our story leaves you with, it is this. The truth rarely needs exaggeration to be worth taking seriously. Sometimes the most ordinary-looking historical record, a fine paid quietly to a manor court, a marriage contract negotiated over cattle, a woman's reputation calculated as carefully as her dowry, tells you far more about how a society actually treated its women than any dramatic half-invented legend ever could. And speaking of the quiet, ordinary historical record, there is one particular document I have been waiting this entire story to finally share with you properly. Not a myth, not a composite character built from patterns across dozens of records, the way we built Isabel at the very beginning of tonight's journey. An actual letter, written or more accurately dictated by an actual young woman, addressed to an actual man she was hoping to marry, that has survived word for word for more than 5 centuries and still exists today for historians to study directly. After a section built almost entirely on legal records, court fines, and one thoroughly debunked legend, I think we've earned something with an actual pulse to it. It might be the single most human document in this entire story. Let's finally read it together next. February 1477, Norfolk, England. A young woman named Marjorie Bruce sits down, or more accurately settles into a chair, while a family servant sharpens a quill nearby, ready to write down whatever she's about to say out loud. Because that is how most letters like this one actually came into being, spoken first, transcribed second, even by women who could read and write perfectly well themselves. Privacy, as we already discovered earlier in this story, was a strange, slippery thing in the medieval world, and even a woman's most personal, tender feelings usually passed through at least one other set of ears before they ever reached the person they were actually meant for. Outside February in Norfolk would have been exactly what you might picture: grey skies pressing low over flat farmland, bare hedgerows, the kind of persistent bone-deep cold that made every warm room in the house feel like a small hard-won victory. Somewhere close by, a fire was almost certainly burning, and in front of it, a young woman was doing something both perfectly ordinary for her time and we now know quietly historic. What Marjorie Bruce said that afternoon and what her family's clerk carefully wrote down as survived. not paraphrased by a chronicler decades later, not reconstructed from court records the way most of this story has been built. The actual document, in something very close to her own words, still exists today, held among a remarkable collection of family correspondence. Historians simply call the Paston Letters over 1,000 surviving documents written by one ambitious English gentry family across roughly a century, preserved against truly staggering odds. The collection stretches across most of the 15th century, and today the original documents are held securely by one of Britain's major national libraries, still studied by historians, precisely because so few ordinary family archives from this period survived warfare and simple neglect anywhere near this completely. Most medieval voices reach us filtered through official records, court rolls, church documents, written by clerks about people rather than by people about their own lives. The Paston Letters are different. They are as close as this era allows people speaking directly to each other, in their own words, about money, about family, and occasionally about love, and buried inside that collection sits something historians consider the earliest known instance in the entire English language of a woman calling the man she hoped to marry her Valentine. I want to walk you through exactly what was happening around that single letter, because the real story behind it is considerably more complicated and considerably more moving than a simple romantic greeting card moment. The man Marjorie was writing to was named John Paston, the third son to carry that name in his family, 33 years old at the time, and quite frankly growing a little desperate. Letters preserved elsewhere in the same family collection reveal that John had been actively searching for a wife for roughly a decade, already pursuing at least 10 separate matches since the late 1460s, none of which had actually made it to the altar. He needed a wealthy match. As a second surviving son, he was not set to inherit the bulk of his family's estate, which meant a good marriage was not simply a romantic milestone for him. It was quite plainly his best remaining path toward financial security. Reading through his own family's surviving letters, you can almost track his growing frustration across the years, one hopeful prospect after another, quietly falling apart, sometimes over money, sometimes because a wealthier rival suitor appeared, sometimes for reasons the letters never fully explain. By the time he met Marjorie, John Paston was a man who understood better than almost anyone exactly how easily a promising match could slip away before it ever reached the altar. Marjorie, meanwhile, was probably somewhere between 16 and 20 years old, the daughter of a Norfolk gentleman named Thomas Bruce. And here is where the story starts sounding uncomfortably familiar if you have been following along with us this entire evening. The match between Marjorie and John had stalled not over affection but over money, specifically over her dowry. Thomas Bruce had offered no more than £100, a respectable sum, but apparently not respectable enough for John's own family, who were hoping for considerably more before agreeing to finalise things. Sound familiar? It should. This is the exact same negotiating table we sat beside together earlier in this story. The same careful, unromantic arithmetic of land coin and family standing. Except this time, we get to watch what actually happened next in someone's own words rather than reconstructing it from a composite figure or a court record. Because right in the middle of this financial standoff, Marjorie's own mother, a woman named Elizabeth Bruce, stepped directly into the negotiation and did something rather clever. She wrote to John herself, inviting him to visit the family that particular weekend specifically, because as she pointed out in her letter the following Friday, happened to be St. Valentine's Day, when, as old tradition held, every bird supposedly chose its mate for the coming season. It was not simply small talk. It was deliberate, almost strategic use of romantic timing to nudge a stalled financial negotiation back toward a decision. Come Thursday evening, she suggested stay through the weekend, and let us finally bring this matter to some kind of conclusion. That belief about Valentine's Day and birds choosing partners was not something Elizabeth Bruce invented on the spot either. The idea had already been circulating in English poetry for roughly a century by that point, most famously through the work of a poet most of you have probably heard of, Geoffrey Chaucer, who had written about birds gathering to choose their mates on that particular February day generations earlier. Elizabeth was borrowing a piece of established literary romance and deploying it quite deliberately as a tool to finally close a marriage deal. I have to admit I find that detail almost delightful. A mother using Valentine's Day itself as leverage in a dowry negotiation. Somewhere between wonderfully sweet and shrewdly practical, and honestly, probably both at exactly the same time. It also tells you something important about who actually held influence inside these negotiations, even within a system we have spent this entire story describing as overwhelmingly controlled by fathers and formal contracts. Elizabeth Bruce was not the one legally negotiating the dowry figures on paper. That business belonged to her husband. But she clearly understood exactly how to move the human beings involved in that negotiation, using timing sentiment and a well-chosen literary reference most of her contemporaries would have instantly recognized. Fathers controlled the numbers. Mothers, it seems, frequently controlled the moment. John came, and whatever happened during that particular weekend, we do not have a detailed record of the conversations themselves, only what followed immediately afterward. Marjorie sat down with her family's scribe and dictated a letter to John that still more than 5 centuries later reads as startlingly personal. She addressed him directly as her right well-beloved Valentine, the exact phrase historians point to as the very first documented use of that word in this specific romantic sense anywhere in written English. Everything that came after built on that opening. She wrote of her devotion in language that went well beyond the polite formal tone typical of gentry correspondence, at the time promising her affection, regardless of how the financial negotiations ultimately resolved themselves, even suggesting she would remain loyal to him if his own family's estate turned out to be worth considerably less than everyone currently assumed. Now here's a fair question worth sitting with for a moment, and historians studying this letter still debate it honestly. Was Marjorie's declaration pure unguarded romantic feeling, a completely smitten young woman pouring her heart onto the page? Or was it also simultaneously a clever negotiating tactic, softening her father's otherwise firm financial position by reminding John exactly what he stood to gain beyond the money if he simply agreed to the match? I do not think we actually have to choose between those two explanations, and I would gently push back on anyone who insists we must. Marjorie's letter reads to me as both things at once: sincere affection and quiet, capable persuasion, working together rather than against each other. She was, after all, operating inside the exact same system we have spent this entire story, examining, one where a young woman's own feelings rarely carried much formal legal weight on their own. If genuine love happened to also strengthen her family's negotiating position, why would she have any reason to keep those two things separate in her own letter? There is a small additional detail in her letter that I think deserves real attention, because it connects directly to something we uncovered earlier tonight. Marjorie specifically asked John to keep her letter private, to let no one else read it. And yet we know for certain that at least one other person had already read every word before John ever received it, the very servant who had written it all down at her dictation. Even her most intimate declaration of feeling passed through someone else's hands and eyes before it reached the man it was actually meant for. Privacy, once again, turns out to be something medieval women could request, but rarely something they could fully guarantee even inside their own supposedly personal correspondence. So did it work? Did the letter actually save the match? Not immediately, as it turns out. The dowry dispute continued for a little while longer, even after that Valentine's weekend, apparently stubborn enough that it eventually required outside help to resolve completely. John's own mother, a formidable woman named Margaret Paston, stepped in at some point to help broker a final compromise between the two families. Whatever exact terms were eventually settled on, they were enough. Marjorie Bruce and John Paston married later that same year, and here is where I think the story earns its place in tonight's journey, because it does not simply end at the wedding, the way so many of the stories we tell ourselves about historical romance conveniently do. Their letters continued long after the marriage itself, and they reveal something remarkably rare inside this entire body of historical record we've been working through together. Real, apparently lasting affection. In a letter written roughly a year into their marriage, Marjorie mentions a small ring she had sent John as a keepsake while he travelled on family business, and gently teases him about the reason she keeps thinking of him both day and night. Historians reading between the lines generally agree this was Marjorie's own quiet, characteristically clever way of telling her husband she was expecting their first child. Years later, still in another surviving letter written while John was away in London, Marjorie wrote to him with unmistakable warmth, recalling how long it had been since she'd last been close to him, and asking him to send for her if his business kept him away much longer. This was not a formal, obligatory letter between two people fulfilling a contractual arrangement. This reads like two people who, whatever complicated financial negotiation had originally brought them together, had built something real in the years since. Here's a question worth sitting with honestly for a moment, especially after everything else we have covered together tonight. Does knowing the marriage began as a financial negotiation change how you read the affection in these later letters, or does it make that affection feel even more remarkable, precisely because it was never guaranteed, never assumed, simply built patiently by two specific people over years of ordinary married life? I would love to hear your honest take on that down in the comments below. There is one more piece of this story worth knowing, a quieter, sadder one, because real history rarely wraps itself up in a tidy bow. Roughly 2 years after that Valentine's letter, John's older brother, the head of the Paston family, died suddenly, most likely from illness sweeping through the country at the time. That loss, tragic as it was, changed John's own position entirely. The second son, who had spent a desperate decade searching for a wife, suddenly found himself head of the entire Paston family, and Marjorie, the young woman who had once so carefully, so tenderly negotiated her own worth, in a letter to her Valentine found herself standing beside him as the new head of one of England's most well-documented gentry families. He would go on years later to hold a formal position overseeing naval affairs for the Crown itself, a considerable rise for a once desperate second son, whose own family letters only a few years earlier had painted him as running quietly out of options. I keep returning to this particular story out of everything we've covered so far because it refuses to fit neatly into either extreme we might expect from medieval marriage. It was not purely cold, transactional, loveless arrangement, nor was it purely swept away romance untouched by money and negotiation. It was quite plainly both tangled together in exactly the messy human way real relationships tend to be, whether they happen in a 15th century Norfolk gentry household or in your own life tonight. Every single system we have picked apart across this entire story, the dowries, the church courts, the reputation economy, the wardship auctions, was real and was rarely kind. But Marjorie and John's letters are proof written in genuine ink on genuine parchment that people living inside those same unforgiving structures could still occasionally find each other honestly and hold on. But Marjorie Bruce, whatever hardship came with that stalled dowry negotiation, ultimately got something remarkably close to what she asked for in that letter. A real marriage built on genuine affection that endured for years. Not every woman living through this exact same system was so fortunate. Some fought for a version of that same outcome using an entirely different tool, altogether not a love letter, but a lawsuit standing directly in front of a church court and formally arguing that the marriage arranged for them should never have happened at all. Let's meet some of those women next, because their courage deserves just as much attention as Marjorie's tenderness did. Let's go back to Isabel for a moment, the young woman we started this entire story with standing at that church door on her wedding morning, hearing the priest ask her out loud in front of the whole village whether she consented to the marriage waiting in front of her. She said yes. We watched her say it. But I want you to imagine just for a moment a different version of that exact same morning. What would have actually happened if Isabel, standing at that same threshold, had said something else entirely? Picture the silence that would have followed. The priest pausing, uncertain how to proceed. Her father's face somewhere in the gathered crowd, shifting from confusion into something considerably harder. Whispers moving backward through the villagers, standing behind her faster than anyone could politely contain them. And Isabel herself still standing at that threshold, having just done something almost nobody around her would have known quite how to respond to. Because refusal, however legally available in theory, was rare enough in practice to truly stun an entire gathered community into silence. Because here is something worth remembering clearly. That question the priest asked was not simply ceremonial decoration. It was, as we established earlier in this story, the entire legal foundation the marriage rested on. Which means, at least on paper, a woman who felt forced into that moment had a real formally recognized legal path available to her, not in the instant itself standing frozen in front of her entire community, but afterward through the church's own court system, arguing that her earlier consent had never actually been free at all. Some women took exactly that path, and their stories pieced together from real surviving petitions deserve far more attention than they usually get. To understand how this actually worked, we need to go back to the legal reasoning itself, because it is considerably more sophisticated than you might expect from an institution we have spent much of this story criticizing rather heavily. Canon law, developing steadily across the 12th and 13th centuries, established a clear principle. A marriage formed through force or genuine fear could be formally declared invalid by the church, essentially treated as though it had never legally happened at all. And the definition of force turned out to be broader than you might assume. One church ruling from the early 13th century issued by a pope, reviewing a disputed betrothal contract, specifically addressed a case where a penalty clause had been written into the agreement, financially punishing whoever backed out of the match later. The Pope ruled that clause itself amounted to a form of coercion, since a marriage bound together partly through fear of financial ruin could hardly be called freely chosen at all. Marriages, he insisted, were supposed to remain free. Think about how quietly clever that ruling actually was. It would have been simple enough for church law to only recognize the most obvious dramatic forms of coercion, a literal threat of violence, a hand forced against a Bible. Instead, this ruling acknowledged something far more subtle, that a family could trap a young person into marriage without ever raising a fist at all, simply by making the financial cost of walking away unbearable. A penalty clause sitting quietly inside an otherwise ordinary contract could function as a kind of invisible leash, and the church, at least in this particular ruling, refused to pretend it did not. A different papal ruling, issued a few decades later, pushed this reasoning even further, addressing situations where the pressure applied was not even directed at the bride or groom themselves. If a family threatened harm towards someone, the reluctant party cared about a parent, a sibling, anyone close enough that the threat still functioned as real pressure. That too could count as sufficient coercion to invalidate the marriage that followed. In other words, church law recognized remarkably early that fear does not always need to point directly at the person being coerced to still control their decision completely. Imagine a young woman told plainly not that she herself would suffer if she refused, but that her younger sister's own marriage prospects would quietly collapse, or that her elderly mother would lose her home if she did not agree to the match being arranged for her. No blade at her throat, no raised voice, just a carefully aimed threat towards someone she loved, which, as far as this ruling was concerned, counted just as seriously as if the threat had been pointed directly at her. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment, honestly. Does it surprise you that medieval church law had already worked out something this psychologically sophisticated centuries before anyone had a formal vocabulary for coercion, pressure, or consent, the way we casually discuss those concepts today? It surprised me, if I am being completely honest with you. So where did women actually take these arguments? Not simply to a local parish priest, but in a striking number of surviving cases all the way to Rome itself, through an office known as the Apostolic Penitentiary, a Vatican department specifically responsible for handling petitions involving matters of conscience absolution, and relevant to us tonight, requests to formally dissolve marriages entered into under duress. This was not some minor obscure clerical office either. The Apostolic Penitentiary functioned as one of the busiest departments within the entire papal bureaucracy, handling an enormous volume of petitions from across the whole of Christian Europe, covering everything from requests for forgiveness after serious sin to formal dispensations allowing otherwise forbidden marriages, to exactly the kind of coercion petition we are discussing right now. A petition arriving there did not disappear into some dusty, ignored pile. It joined a genuine, functioning bureaucratic process reviewed, recorded, and in many surviving cases formally ruled upon. Historians studying one particular stretch of these surviving petition records, covering roughly the final years of the 1400s, found something remarkably striking once they actually counted and sorted the cases by where they originated. Out of a group of 114 documented petitions specifically involving force or a party being underage, the overwhelming majority, 72 of them, came from Italy alone. 16 more arrived from territories within the German Empire. 13 came from France. 8 travelled from the Iberian Peninsula. Only a small handful, 3 in total, came from anywhere further east. Sit with that geographic pattern for a second, because I think it tells us something important beyond the raw numbers themselves. This was not a rare, isolated legal curiosity quietly used by 1 or 2 exceptionally bold women somewhere in Europe. This was a genuine, functioning, actively used legal pathway, stretching across an entire continent, generating real paperwork, real travel, real formal argument in numbers, substantial enough for modern historians to meaningfully study patterns within. Why Italy so overwhelmingly, you might reasonably wonder. Historians studying this pattern generally point toward a combination of factors: dense urban populations with the wealth and literacy to actually pursue formal legal remedies, closer physical proximity to Rome itself, making the journey considerably less daunting than it would have been from somewhere in northern England or Scandinavia, and a culture of merchant families accustomed to formal contracts, and therefore formal disputes in nearly every corner of their lives. Distance and access, it turns out, shaped who could realistically fight back, almost as much as the underlying injustice itself did. Now let's talk honestly about what actually pursuing one of these petitions would have required, because the legal right existing on paper and the practical ability to use it were, as we have discussed more than once throughout this story, 2 very different things. A woman pursuing this path first needed to recognize clearly that what had happened to her actually qualified as coercion under church law, not simply an unhappy arrangement she personally disliked. She then needed access to someone capable of formally drafting a petition in the correct legal language, likely a local clergyman or trained clerk familiar with canon law procedure. That petition then needed to travel sometimes an enormous physical distance toward Rome itself, or toward whatever regional church authority had been delegated to hear such cases locally. All of this required money. It required literacy, or at minimum access to someone literate willing to help. And perhaps most difficult of all, it required a woman willing to formally publicly challenge her own father, her own family, sometimes her own husband inside a legal system that everyone around her expected her to simply quietly accept instead. Consider the physical logistics alone, setting the emotional courage aside for a moment. A petition originating in a small town somewhere in France or the German territories needed to physically travel by messenger, by merchant caravan, sometimes by the petitioner's own representative across mountains, unreliable roads, and considerable distance before it ever reached the desks in Rome capable of ruling on it. That journey took time, sometimes many months. It took money to fund. And it required trusting that a document representing your entire future would not simply vanish somewhere along hundreds of miles of medieval road. Historians combing through these petitions today still find themselves quietly struck by the human specifics preserved inside otherwise dry legal Latin, a father's exact threat recorded almost verbatim, a daughter's precise fear described in careful clerical language never meant for storytelling, yet somehow still landing with real emotional weight 500 years later. I want you to imagine the sheer nerve that decision required. Not simply feeling wronged privately, which countless women throughout this entire story almost certainly felt. Actually standing up, gathering witnesses, formally accusing the people who arranged her marriage of coercing her into it, knowing that pursuing the case publicly branded her for the rest of her life in that community as the woman who fought her own family in a church court. Some women did it anyway. And here is what I find most worth sitting with once you actually read through the kinds of cases these records describe. The petitions were not limited to poor, powerless women with nothing left to lose either. Cases came from across the social spectrum, some involving families with genuine standing and property at stake, which tells you the willingness to fight was never simply about desperation. Sometimes it was about a woman with real resources, real connections, and real reason to expect the church might actually take her seriously, deciding that a formally documented wrong deserved a formal documented fight. And notably, the petitions were not exclusively filed by women either, though women's voices sit at the centre of the cases historians find most striking. Some records show young men bringing nearly identical complaints, arguing they too had been pressured into unwanted matches by ambitious or desperate families. Coercion, it turns out, did not respect gender quite as cleanly as the rest of this story's economic machinery so often did. A son forced into an unwanted marriage to save a struggling family's finances could in theory walk the exact same legal road toward Rome that a coerced daughter could. I keep circling back to a particular thought while sitting with all of this, and I want to share it honestly rather than simply moving past it. We have spent a considerable amount of this story examining just how thoroughly medieval systems worked to keep women contained, watched, priced, and controlled. It would be easy and honestly understandable to walk away from all of that, believing medieval women were purely passive figures inside their own lives, simply enduring whatever arrangement landed on them. These petitions complicate that picture in an important way. They do not erase the unfairness underneath the system. If anything, they highlight it more sharply, because a woman should never have needed to travel toward Rome, hire a clerk, and formally argue her own humanity in front of strangers just to escape a marriage she never actually agreed to. But within that deeply unfair system, real women in real, documented numbers chose to fight anyway, using the very same legal language that had been used to trap so many others. There is something almost defiant in that image, a young woman sitting across from a clerk carefully explaining in formal legal language exactly how her own family had wronged her, trusting that language of all things might actually set her free. Here's a question worth asking yourself honestly, especially after everything we have covered together tonight. Do you think knowing this changes how you picture medieval women overall? Not as one single uniform group quietly accepting their circumstances, but as individuals, some resigned, some quietly negotiating like Marjorie did in the story we just finished together, and some willing to formally fight the entire system in front of the one authority powerful enough to actually overrule it. I would love to hear your honest reaction to that down in the comments below, because that is really the thread connecting everything we've explored across this entire story so far. Not one single medieval woman's experience repeated identically across an entire continent for centuries, but a wide, complicated range of responses all operating inside the exact same rigid, unfair structure. Some married young and grew to love the stranger they were given. Some fought formally in courts using the system's own rules against it. And some, as we are about to discover, found their only real path toward freedom, not by challenging marriage directly at all, but by waiting sometimes for years for circumstances entirely outside their control to hand them an opportunity marriage itself had never offered. Because fighting a marriage before it ever fully closed around you was one path toward freedom, and clearly a considerably difficult one. But there was another path, entirely one that did not require a single petition, a single clerk, or a single journey toward Rome at all. One particular turn of fate that occasionally handed a medieval woman more real independence than almost anything else available to her in this entire story. And it began almost always quietly with a funeral. Let's step into that next. A funeral is a strange place to find freedom. But for a specific category of medieval woman, it is exactly where something resembling real independence quietly began. Think back across everything we have covered together so far in this story. A daughter controlled by her father, her value calculated in coin and cattle, before she ever spoke a word about her own future. A wife legally absorbed into her husband's identity the moment she married him, unable in most circumstances to independently own property, sign a contract, or represent herself in court without him standing legally beside her. Medieval law actually had a specific term for that condition, treating a married woman as legally covered by her husband's identity rather than existing as a fully separate legal person in her own right, and then her husband died. I know that sounds like an unusually grim place to locate a story about freedom. But stay with me, because widowhood turns out to be one of the strangest, most quietly consequential plot twists in this entire season of a woman's medieval life. The moment her husband passed away, a woman's legal status shifted, sometimes dramatically. She was no longer covered by anyone. For the first time since childhood, she could in many parts of medieval Europe own property outright, in her own name, enter into contracts, sue, and be sued directly in court. Run a business and make binding decisions about her own household without needing a husband's or father's approval standing behind every single one of them. Historians use a specific legal term for this status, describing her as a woman standing alone legally for the very first time in her adult life. The distinction mattered enormously in daily practical terms, not simply in legal theory. A married woman under this same system generally could not independently sign a binding contract, could not sue a debtor who owed her money without her husband formally joining the case, and in most circumstances could not even keep wages she personally earned entirely separate from her husband's control. A widow suddenly could do all of it, She could hire workers, collect debts owed to her late husband's estate, appear before a judge in her own name, and make decisions about her household's future without seeking anyone else's formal permission first. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. Doesn't it feel almost bitterly ironic that the single moment offering a medieval woman the most legal autonomy she would ever experience arrived only through the death of the very man whose permission had shaped nearly every decision of her life up to that point? Now, this newfound independence was not simply symbolic. It usually came with real, tangible economic backing thanks to something called dower. Remember that marriage contract we examined earlier in this story, the one negotiated so carefully alongside the dowry itself? Buried inside many of those same agreements sat a separate promise made by the husband's family, guaranteeing his widow a fixed portion of his property frequently, 1/3 of his total estate set aside specifically to support her for the remainder of her own life if she happened to outlive him. It was in a sense medieval society's own built-in insurance policy negotiated years in advance, often by a young bride's own anxious father hoping to protect his daughter's future, long after he himself would no longer be around to intervene on her behalf. That fraction 1/3 shows up again and again across surviving records precisely because it was not simply informal custom. It was frequently written directly into the legal framework governing land inheritance itself, meaning a husband could not easily negotiate his widow's protection away entirely, even if he had wanted to. Whatever else a marriage contract argued over coin, cattle, family pride, this particular clause was often treated as close to non-negotiable. For a woman who received it and managed it well, dower could mean something remarkably rare in this entire story. Financial security that belonged entirely to her, answerable to no husband, no father, no waiting heir, standing impatiently over her shoulder. But before we get too comfortable imagining widowhood as some tidy guaranteed happy ending, let's talk honestly about the pressure that frequently followed almost immediately behind it. Because a widow holding valuable dower land was not simply left alone to quietly enjoy her new independence. She instantly became, in the coldest practical sense, an attractive target all over again. Families with unmarried sons, lords looking to strengthen alliances, sometimes even the crown itself, often moved quickly to encourage, or in less polite cases pressure, a newly widowed woman back into a second marriage, specifically to bring her land and income back under someone else's control. Remember the Magna Carta clause we touched on earlier in this story, the one specifically declaring that a widow could not be forced into remarriage against her will. That protection existed formally in writing, but like so many of the paper protections we've examined throughout this entire season, the gap between what the law promised and what actually happened in practice could stretch remarkably wide. And it is worth remembering honestly that everything we're describing in this part of the story mattered enormously more for women who actually had land to trade, or an education to fall back on in the first place. A poor widow left with small children and no dower worth fighting over rarely experienced any of this as liberation. For her, a husband's death often meant hardship, not freedom, a truth this story would be dishonest to skip past, simply because it complicates an otherwise inspiring narrative. Here is a detail that truly surprised me when I first came across it properly. Some widows, particularly wealthier ones holding land directly from the crown, actually paid a formal fee, sometimes a considerable one specifically for the legal right to remain unmarried or alternatively to choose their own next husband, rather than accept whoever the crown or a local lord decided to assign them. Surviving financial records document these payments. Plainly, women handing over real money, essentially purchasing their own continued independence from a system that would otherwise have quietly reassigned their future to someone else entirely. Sit with that for a second. Freedom itself priced, itemized and sold back to the very women who had just through no choice or design of their own, briefly glimpsed what independence actually felt like. It is a strange, almost circular kind of justice, if you can even call it that. The very system that had spent an entire lifetime pricing a woman's worth in dowries, fines, and marriage portions simply kept right on pricing her, straight through widowhood right up until the moment she finally had enough resources of her own to buy her way out of its reach entirely. For widows further down the social ladder without vast estates or dower land worth fighting over independence often looked considerably more practical and honestly more impressive in its own quiet way. In many medieval towns, a widow could legally step directly into her late husband's trade, continuing to run his workshop, his shop or his membership within a local craft guild entirely in her own name. Town and guild records from across medieval Europe document women brewing, baking, trading cloth and managing workshops as recognised functioning members of their local economy, not simply as a deceased man's leftover responsibility, but as legitimate businesswomen in their own right. Take brewing as one particularly vivid example. Across much of medieval England, brewing ale was overwhelmingly a woman's trade to begin with, married and unmarried alike, and a widow inheriting her husband's brewing operation was often simply continuing work she had already been doing herself for years, now finally recognised formally in records and in law as her own enterprise rather than technically his. The same pattern shows up in tailoring, in cloth trading, in running inns and taverns. Widowhood did not always hand a woman an entirely new skill set. Frequently it simply handed her formal legal credit for expertise she had quietly been exercising all along. I find something quietly remarkable in that particular reality, especially set against nearly everything else we have covered together tonight. A woman who had spent her entire married life legally invisible behind her husband's name could upon his death suddenly become the very visible functioning owner of his trade, his tools and his reputation in the marketplace. Now, marriage and business were not the only two doors available to a woman navigating life after her husband's death, or for some women life before a husband ever entered the picture at all. There was one more path chosen deliberately by some, and it led not toward a marketplace but through the doors of a convent. We touched earlier in this story on convents functioning as something close to an economic overflow valve, absorbing daughters whose families simply could not afford to marry them all off respectably. That was real and worth remembering. But it was never the entire picture, and I think it is worth giving the fuller version its due here. For certain women, particularly those drawn to learning writing music or simply a life free from a husband's authority altogether, the convent offered something remarkably rare across this entire story: autonomy, intellectual space, and in some remarkable cases real influence stretching far beyond the convent's own walls. Consider a German abbess born at the very end of the 11th century, a woman whose name still shows up regularly in discussions of medieval music, medicine and theology today. She entered religious life as a child, eventually rose to lead her own convent, and went on to compose an extraordinary body of sacred music, some of which is still performed and recorded today, nearly 9 centuries later. She also wrote extensively on natural science, and medicine corresponded directly with popes, kings, and some of the most powerful political figures of her era, and was by any reasonable measure one of the most intellectually influential people in Europe during her lifetime, regardless of gender. None of that would have been remotely possible for her as a medieval wife managing a household, negotiating a husband's dinner guests and answering to his authority in nearly every formal decision of her life. She's remembered today across multiple disciplines at once, as a composer whose surviving music is still performed in concert halls, as an early medical writer whose observations on the human body were taken seriously by physicians of her era, and as a mystic whose visionary writing shaped theological conversation well beyond her own convent's walls. Try naming another medieval woman who managed to influence music, medicine, and theology simultaneously, using nothing but a life built specifically around the absence of a husband. That is what I mean when I say the convent offered something truly different from marriage, not merely an absence of a husband, but an entirely different structure altogether, one where a woman's intellect, ambition, and voice could in the right circumstances actually be cultivated rather than quietly contained. And widowhood itself occasionally produced its own version of that same remarkable outcome outside convent walls entirely. There is one particular widow from this period whose story I've been waiting to share with you, because I think it captures nearly everything this entire evening has been building toward. She was widowed young, left suddenly responsible for her mother and niece and her own 3 children with very little financial security to actually support any of them. Rather than quietly remarrying or quietly fading into dependency on relatives, she did something remarkably bold for a woman of her era. She began writing professionally for money, becoming one of the very first women in Europe known to support herself and her entire family, primarily through her own literary work. She went on to write one of the most striking defences of women produced anywhere in medieval literature, directly challenging centuries of writing that had painted women as morally weak, foolish, or dangerous. And notably, given everything we have spent this entire story examining together, she also wrote practical, detailed guidance specifically for other widows, real advice on protecting their legal rights, managing estates, and navigating exactly the kind of pressure and vulnerability we just finished discussing a few minutes ago. She did not simply escape the system theoretically. She turned around and handed other women a map for escaping it too. I think about the sheer nerve that decision required a young widow still grieving, still legally vulnerable in 100 different ways. We have spent this entire story cataloguing, deciding that her pen, rather than a hurried second marriage, would be the thing that kept her family fed. It did not happen overnight, and it was not an easy or guaranteed path. But she proved in real, documented, surviving pages we can still read today that it was possible. Here's a question worth sitting with, honestly, especially now that we've walked through nearly this woman's entire life cycle together tonight: daughter, bride, wife, and now, finally, widow. Do you think these rare pockets of freedom, dower land, a guild membership, a convent, a writing career existed because medieval society actually valued women's independence in certain circumstances, or simply because death and widowhood happened to create legal gaps, too inconvenient or too profitable to fully close? I would love to hear your honest read on that down in the comments below, because I do not think these women found freedom because the system was ever designed to offer it to them generously. I think they found it in the cracks in the specific legal gaps left open by inheritance, law, canon law, and economic necessity, and then remarkably often simply refused to let those cracks quietly close again. We've now walked through nearly this entire arc together, from a girl's earliest betrothal, through dowries, church rules, beauty standards, surveillance myth, real love, real resistance, and now, finally, the strange, hard-won freedom some women eventually found on the other side of it all. Which brings us at last to the question sitting quietly underneath everything we have covered tonight. What does any of this actually teach us sitting here centuries later about love, about choice, and about what has truly changed since then? Let's bring it all together next. Let's go back to Isabel one final time, because I think she deserves a proper goodbye before we close this story together. You will remember we told you plainly at the very beginning that she was never one single real documented woman. She was a composite stitched together from patterns found across hundreds of real court records, letters, and church documents. Which means, honestly, I cannot tell you what happened to her after that wedding feast ended and the torches finally burned low. I do not know if her marriage grew slowly and quietly into real affection, the way Marjorie and John Paston's did. I do not know if she ever stood in front of a church court gathering her courage, the way some of the women in the apostolic penitentiary records did, arguing that her own consent had never truly been free. I do not know if she outlived her husband and spent her final years running a household entirely her own, the way certain widows in this story eventually did. And I think that uncertainty is actually the most honest ending I can possibly give her, because it was true for real women across this entire period too. There was never one single medieval female experience, one single outcome waiting at the end of that church door. There were thousands of different Isabels living out thousands of different versions of this exact same story, some ending in quiet contentment, some in genuine sorrow, most somewhere complicated and human in between the two. I think that is actually why I chose to build her the way we did all the way back at the very beginning of this story, rather than simply opening with a dry recitation of laws and statistics. Facts alone can tell you that dowries existed, that consent was legally required, that wardship could be sold to the highest bidder. But facts alone rarely let you feel the weight of standing at that threshold yourself, in someone else's shoes on someone else's wedding morning. Isabel was never meant to be a definitive answer. She was meant to be a door one you could actually walk through, so that everything we uncovered afterward would land somewhere real rather than staying safely abstract. So let's step back now all the way out and look at the whole shape of what we've actually built together tonight. We started with a wedding neither party fully chose. We moved through dowries measured in coin and cattle, canon law wrestling honestly with what real consent should actually mean, children promised away before they could speak in full sentences, and an entire elaborate fantasy of courtly love invented ironically by the very same people negotiating those cold practical marriages. We looked at beauty turned into moral obligation, reputation turned into a second more fragile dowry, and a myth about locked metal devices that turned out to be far less true and far less necessary than the quieter, more bureaucratic cruelty sitting right beside it the entire time. We met a real young woman who fought for her own marriage using nothing but a well-timed letter, and other real women who fought for their freedom, using nothing but formal legal language and considerable courage. And finally, we watched a small number of women through widowhood, through convent life, through sheer stubborn talent find genuine independence tucked into the narrow cracks a deeply unfair system had never quite managed to seal shut. That is 11 distinct doors we walk through together tonight, each one opening onto a slightly different room inside the exact same house. And if there is one thing I hope became clear somewhere along the way, it is that none of those rooms ever stood entirely alone. The dowry conversation in room 1 quietly shaped the beauty standards in room 6. The church's careful consent doctrine in room 3 is the exact same doctrine those brave women dragged into a Roman courtroom in room 10. Nothing in this story happened in isolation. It was always one single interconnected machine, and every woman we met tonight was navigating the whole of it at once, not simply the one piece we happened to be examining in any given moment. Here's a question worth sitting with now that you can see the whole shape of it laid out together. If you had to boil this entire evening down to one single sentence, what do you think it would actually be? I've been sitting with that question myself through every part of researching and writing this story for you, and here is where I keep landing. Medieval dating, if we can even call it that, was never really about romance failing to exist. It was about romance being treated as something dangerous, something that needed to be tightly managed, priced, negotiated around, and occasionally quietly smuggled in through the side door, because the front door was almost always occupied by land coin and family strategy instead. And I think that distinction matters enormously, because it would be easy sitting here after everything we have covered to walk away believing medieval people simply did not feel love the way we do today. That is not what the record actually shows. Marjorie Bruce felt something real enough to write it down in her own words more than 5 centuries ago and have it survive intact until tonight. Hildegard of Bingen felt something real enough about her own faith and her own mind to build an entire body of music and writing around it, from inside convent walls that were supposed to contain her, not amplify her. Christine de Pizan felt something real enough about injustice itself to spend her widowhood writing directly back at the men who had spent centuries writing women down. The feelings were there all along, exactly as real and as complicated as ours are tonight. What was missing far more often than not was simply the room to act on them freely. I think that reframing matters, especially for anyone watching tonight who has ever felt boxed in by circumstances they did not choose, a family expecting a certain path, a culture with its own quiet rules about who you are supposed to love and how. You are not the first person to feel that particular weight. Women 5, 6, 7 centuries before you carried something remarkably similar, and plenty of them still found small, stubborn ways to protect what mattered most to them. Anyway, a letter, a lawsuit, a convent, a trade, a quiet refusal to simply disappear into whatever role had been assigned to them. The tools available to you now look almost nothing like theirs. The underlying instinct to want a life and a love that actually feels like your own has apparently never once gone out of fashion. Here's something I think is truly worth sitting with for a moment, especially if you're watching this tonight wrapped up somewhere warm, scrolling past this after a long day. We tend to imagine progress as a straight, steady line. Medieval darkness slowly giving way to modern enlightenment, 1 century quietly improving on the last. The real picture, at least from where I am standing after spending this much time inside these records, looks messier than that. Some threads from this story have truly meaningfully loosened. Consent is no longer a theoretical door standing open in theory alone. Most of you watching tonight chose your own partner based on your own feelings without a dowry ledger or a wardship auction anywhere in sight. That is not a small thing. That is centuries of quiet, hard-fought change condensed into something we now take almost entirely for granted, but a few other threads, I would gently argue, have simply changed shape rather than disappearing entirely. Reputation still travels faster than truth, just through different channels now than a village church door. Appearance still gets quietly weighed in ways we do not always want to admit out loud, even if the specific standards have shifted from a towering plucked forehead to whatever this particular decade happens to be chasing instead. And choosing a partner, however free and personal it feels today, still happens inside its own quiet. Economics, compatibility, ambition, financial stability, family approval, even now, even with love sitting clearly and rightfully at the center of the decision. Think about how naturally we still describe someone as a good match or a catch language quietly borrowed, straight from an economic vocabulary, even when nobody involved is thinking about coins or cattle at all. Think about how a first impression still gets shaped in seconds by appearance, by a carefully chosen profile picture, in a way our medieval towering forehead trend would probably recognize instantly, even if it would find our specific standards baffling. Think about how quickly an unfair rumor can still end a relationship before it properly begins spreading now through a phone screen rather than a village well, but landing with almost identical force. I am not drawing these comparisons to suggest nothing has changed. I am drawing them because I think the shape of human courtship stripped down to its bones has always cared about roughly the same handful of things: status, appearance, trust and reputation, and every era simply builds its own particular scaffolding around those same old bones. I'm not saying that to flatten the very real progress we've made since Isabel's morning at that church door. I'm saying it because I think the most honest way to honour a story like this one is to resist the easy, comfortable version where the past was simply backward and we sitting here now have it all figured out. Some things changed because people fought for them formally in courtrooms, in letters. In quiet daily defiance, historians are still uncovering evidence of today. And some things simply put on new clothes and kept walking. Can I ask you something honestly before we close this out for tonight? After everything we have walked through together, which part of this story do you think you will find yourself thinking about again later? Maybe next week. Maybe the next time you're getting ready for a first date or scrolling through someone's profile, or simply having a quiet conversation with someone you love. Was it Isabel standing at that church door? Was it Marjorie turning a stalled dowry negotiation into one of the tenderest surviving letters in the English language? Was it the women who travelled formally toward Rome itself, refusing to simply accept a marriage they never agreed to? I would love to know down in the comments. And I do read every single one of them, even the ones that arrive weeks after a story like this first goes up. I want to say something honest to you before we close, if you will let me, because I do not think I could have written this particular story with real integrity without sitting inside it myself for quite a while first. Researching this changed how I read almost every old portrait, every dusty church record, every casual joke about medieval marriage I've ever heard tossed around before. It is easy to laugh at the strangeness of the past from a safe, comfortable distance. The towering forehead, the mythical metal belt, the fathers negotiating over cattle counts. It is considerably harder, and I think considerably more worthwhile, to actually sit with the real women underneath all of it, doing the very human work of surviving, negotiating, occasionally rebelling, and sometimes remarkably actually falling in love inside a system that was rarely built with their well-being anywhere near its centre. I found myself more than once during the writing of this particular story, quietly rooting for women who've been gone for over 500 years, hoping almost irrationally that Isabel's marriage grew kind, that the women who travelled toward Rome won their cases, that every quiet, unnamed woman behind every dry manorial fine found some small measure of peace eventually. History cannot always tell us how these stories actually ended, but it can tell us clearly and repeatedly that these women were never simply footnotes waiting for us to notice them. They were the whole story all along, that more than any single fact or figure we covered tonight is what I hope stays with you longest. So before I let you drift off properly or move on with whatever the rest of your evening holds, thank you, honestly and warmly, for spending this much time here with me tonight. Stories like this one take a considerable amount of care to put together properly, and having you here all the way to this final moment means more than a passing comment ever could fully capture. If something in tonight's journey moved you, taught you something new, or simply kept you company through a quiet evening, a small like on this video or a gentle comment sharing your own thoughts honestly helps this kind of storytelling keep finding its way to more people who might need exactly this. A slow, honest, carefully researched story to fall asleep to. And if you are new here or simply have not yet done so, consider staying a little closer, subscribing quietly wherever you are watching so the next story finds you without you needing to go looking for it. It honestly takes very little effort on your end one tap, and it makes a real measurable difference on mine in whether stories like tonight's continue to get made carefully, thoroughly and honestly, the way I believe this particular subject actually deserves. Because there will be a next story, another door, another century, another set of real women and real rules waiting to be carefully, honestly unpacked right here, the same way we have spent this entire evening together. For now, though, let the light stay low, let your breathing slow, and let Isabel and Marjorie and every other woman we walked beside tonight rest quietly in the place where history keeps them safest, remembered honestly in full, exactly as they actually were. For now, let this be enough. A church door, a stalled negotiation turned into a love letter, a locked myth finally unlocked, and a handful of women who against every possible obstacle still managed to hold on to something that was truly unmistakably theirs. Sleep well, and I will see you again soon for the next story.